Okay, Borodar, Croeso Pawb. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the board meeting of the Welsh Ambulance Services Trust. For those of you watching in, my name is Martin Woodford. I'm the chair of the board. We're here today, I'd like to say in sunny Wrexham, but I'm sure it will brighten up later on. But it is genuinely good to be here at Glyndŵr University, who are hosting us today, so thank you to them. I think it was 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, we were last here, so it's very good to return on the road and to visit different parts of Wales pretty much for the first time. A reminder which you all know, I'm sure, this is a meeting in public, not a public meeting, so it is accessible to folk on Zoom and Facebook, so people are watching in. We are recording the meeting as usual for minute-taking purposes. Unlike previous meetings, though, we're not taking questions from the public. I haven't taken questions from the public in advance, nor are we during the meeting, but we do have an engagement session, as you will know, scheduled for this afternoon here at 2 p.m. So we'll see how that pans out. We have Welsh language capability in terms of Zoom. You can actually click on, and there's a Welsh English translation facility on there. Unfortunately, not British Sign Language today, so we'll obviously endeavour to correct that for future meetings. In terms of protocol, we haven't got the worry of all being on Zoom, raising hands on the computer, but in view of the fact that we're being watched, if you like, people joining us on screen, if you could raise your hand when you want to speak, just so that we don't talk over each other, it will make it easier to the listener. So I know, Rachel, I think you were one of our board meetings on watching it, and it was quite difficult for people spoke at the same time. Quite a lengthy agenda, some key items there today. We've been very generous. We're going to keep you going till 11:20, when we'll take a 10-minute comfort break. But things are pretty tight, so we'll need to aim to finish around 1 o'clock. So without further ado, shall we, if you're happy, we'll make a start. So welcome to you all. We've had some apologies from Bethan Evans, Joe Singh and Hannah Rowan, non-executive directors. No other apologies that I'm aware of. Okay. I'd like to welcome Leanne Smith, who I think you're on the imminently to become acting director of digital. So you're joining us today, which is brilliant. So welcome, first board meeting. I think we're quorate, so we can crack on. Declarations of interest next. Now we're not recording standing declarations henceforth because they're on register. Essentially, Trish, that's right, isn't it? So those are there for viewing if people have any queries. But are there any other additional declarations that people need to make today? Okay, brilliant. We then move on to previous minutes for approval. So I'm not going to go through my page. They've been meticulously studied, but just to see whether there are any points of accuracy. So the minutes of the open board on the 26th of May, are there any points of accuracy there? Yes. Okay, happy to approve those? Yes. Thank you. Similarly, the special meeting we held on the 13th of June, any points of accuracy from those minutes? That was also an open board meeting. No. Okay, happy then, you happy to agree? Yes. Good. Matters arising, we have the action log. And from my record, I think there are 2 items by way of sequel. One is update on the Heart Hazardous Areas Response Team 10-year anniversary, and I think that's all been agreed. There is a date. There is 8th of September. Okay, so we will be marking that significant anniversary. And the second item was the staff story video, which we didn't manage to run last time. Technology permitting, Steve, that is on the agenda very shortly, isn't it? Yes. Okay. So those are the kind of preliminaries which put us almost on schedule immediately, which is good. So let's move on to, unless there are any other matters arising, forgive me. Okay. Let's move on to my report. Unusually for me, there is a short written document there which I'll take as read, but they are both of significance, which is why I've recorded them. Firstly, the confirmation of the appointment of my successor, Colin Dennis. His appointment has been approved by the Minister. 4-year appointment from the 1st of October 22, so, which is good news. So we've got continuity of chairmanship. There's reference in the paper to handover. I've actually had a lengthy phone conversation with Colin a week ago, and we're going to meet up face to face. I think yourself and Trish, Jason, have both met him as well, talking about induction arrangements, handover, and so on. So that will unfold over the next 2 months.
Yeah.
So it all looks, from that perspective, on track and promising that we can move seamlessly.
Seamless handover.
Seamless is the word today. So that was the first item. The second item, which I think it's important we do capture in the board, in my report, is the appointment of new trade union board and committee representatives following elections on the 30th of June. Some familiar faces, which is great, but I think formally, though she's not here, Sharon Thorpe is a deputy board attendee. Welcome her, because she's not been on the board team before. We've also got Mark Marsden, Keith Rogers, Marcus Biggers as new attendees at committee, if I'm right. So I'd like to welcome them. So I don't think formal approval is required. They're elected nominees, but we'd like to note those appointments, which is good news, and yourselves here again, which is great. There's one absence or departee of note, which is Craig Brown. So I just wanted to place on record my thanks as board chair for his contributions to the board over recent times. I've always found his contributions very insightful and helpful, constructive, really good insight from one-on-one perspective, and so on. I think he's going to be missed, but I'm sure we haven't seen the last of him. But you're happy with the board, thanks for his contribution. Good. Okay. I just want to say a few words in addition to that. I was reflecting on, well, what does the chair get up to? Every now and again, I have a look to find out what I've been doing. It's quite interesting, because looking back over the last couple of months since the May board, it's quite clear there's a correlation between what I do and what we've got on the agenda today. I think firstly, what was in my mind was about our staff in terms of the internal situation in the organisation, and connecting on that front, because I'm very conscious as chair that staff have had a pretty tough time of late. A lot of activities in that territory. I think firstly, recognising achievement has been a big theme the last few months. I think we've had 3 long service awards: Cardiff, Aberystwyth and Mandringan. There was another one earlier than that, which fell outside that 2-month period. We also recognise the achievement of actually opening a new ambulance station in Aberystwyth effectively, which is very well attended by board colleagues. So thank you. And also join your team, Lee, for the Platinum Jubilee medals and coins and so on to be handed out, which I think went very well. And again, it was all about achievement and service, which I think is important in these tough times. Also managed to get out, talking to staff and so on. Had a very good tour of North Paris, around the ambulance stations there. Very positive atmosphere actually in that part of the world. Visited 3 stations. And actually 2 weeks ago I was up here in Wrexham, visited Dobbs Hill as well. Again, in spite of all, people very positive, and also managed to talk to crews outside the Wrexham Miler in quite a lengthy queue, and actually had a tour of A&E, which was very enlightening, because the pressures in that hospital are enormous, and that's something we need to recognise. Beyond that, looking outwards, a lot of connection with stakeholders more generally, which inevitably came back to most of those meetings, the service pressures that everybody's experiencing. So a couple of chairs peer group meetings, very much dedicated to that theme. The North Wales Regional Leadership Board brings in the local authorities very much in the loop as to the pressures across the piece, gradually coalescing with health. I think Jason, you and I were in part both attended the Association of Ambulance CEOs meetings, the council, and the chairs meeting. The chairs meeting was dominated by the UK picture around handover delays, and a lot of sharing of angst about that issue, which was therapeutic, but I don't think anybody's got any magical solutions. And also looking at was, Estelle, you and I had, I think, a successful meeting with some of the local politicians from the Gower about their specific concerns about the fire co-responding service there, which I think we made good progress on, which was important. Then there were a range of specific outward-looking meetings, which I think are directly pertinent today, which I put in the box of accountability meetings and also discussions specifically dedicated to these service pressures. And this is where I think we're trying to influence key players. So my appraisal with the minister, that turned inevitably to current situation, ambulance response times. Jason and I met with the minister along with chairs and CEOs across Wales. And I think it's fair to say, I think by dint of some of our lobbying, very clear messages were given about the need to reduce handover delays at hospitals. Myself, 3 committee chairs. Jason also met with the chair and chief commissioner from EAST to discuss our concerns around patient safety associated with ambulance delays. And I know that's been recorded in the summary report which we've got. And I think probably the most significant meeting in terms of cranking up the solutions, we'll come back to this, was that convened by the Director General with all chairs and CEOs to say, you know, we need to take leadership of this issue and to enact certain changes, which we'll come back to later on. So looking at my activities, I'm sorry to labour them, but the point I'm trying to convey is I think they are congruent with what is happening, both in terms of connecting with staff, getting their insights and remaining connected, because in these times of pressure, that's hugely important. And also looking outwards and connecting with partners and attempting to influence the agenda outside the organisation. The piece that you'll probably say what's missing is the patient and the public. And we'll return to that under the important item on the agenda around engagement, which I think in a way is that paper is about, okay, given the pressures of now, what might a brighter future look like if we were to enact our strategy and how do we connect people with that. So it's kind of the obverse of the pressure we're facing and potentially way out of some of our field. So that's an unusually lengthy report from me, but I thought it was important in the context we're in. I hope that segues into your report, Jason, which is to follow. I think you just have to note my report, which is difficult when most of it is verbal. Are you happy to note what I've said and written?
Yes, we are. Yes. Thanks, Chairman. All right, so if we go to item 6 on the agenda, then so this is the usual report covering activities across the organisation. I'll just pull out as normal a couple of areas to highlight for the board, and then happy to take any questions. Firstly, if I can turn to paragraph 16, please. So this is managing attendance. I just want to draw attention to this. Because the board will be familiar that we agreed an improvement trajectory with our commissioners, which features in our IMTP for this year, specifically for attendance in EMS, so that's emergency medical service, and just refreshing myself with the trajectory as I often do. The actual position when we started with that trajectory in March was 15%, so absence rates are 15% in EMS in March. Where we find ourselves in June as a result of the nearly 40-point action plan and the good work that's been going on between the ops management team and the workforce team, is attendance now at about 9.2% for June, so down nearly 6% on where we started with the trajectory at the beginning of the year. It's important for us to remember as a board, of course, that trajectory was framed against the position of how we manage COVID absence, and there are certain exceptions that still have been agreed on a national basis that remain in place. And of course, we have to manage improvement in our attendance compassionately for our people and do it in a balanced and fair and measured way. That said, of course, it's important, we know this as a board, don't we, that we do have to see improvement in our attendance rates. And I think it's pleasing to see, particularly for me, through the work that the two teams that I've just mentioned have been doing. You know, we've now seen a switch in long-term absence, particularly where we've got less cases going into long-term absence than each month than those that we're resolving. So we're resolving more cases of long-term absence each month than we've got new cases starting. So that also signals that we've got better support arrangements and kind of management around the short-term absence and preventing it from going into long-term. So much more to go yet, Chairman, on this, but encouraging signs. And I think just it's important for us to recognise and reflect all this. It's a challenging area for us. Circumstances on the streets and in our patrol rooms particularly are very challenging, as you've just mentioned in your report and touch on later. Of course, against that backdrop, we do still need to see improvement in attendance, and we are starting to deliver that against the trajectory that we set ourselves. So at the moment, we are performing well against the trajectory that we set, and indeed we're under that. So that's paragraph 16. I don't know, Catherine, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No.
Okay, next paragraph I just want to draw out, if I can, is actually quite an exciting one. And EMT colleagues will hear more about this in the next couple of weeks. Paragraph 43. So this is work. That's going on with our team in partnership or in collaboration with NIRE and Bevan, following a Bevan Commission bid for funding to develop essentially mobile or field X-ray capability, which our people will be able to have access to. Now that the protocols for this use, Wendy, I think, is still being developed, but you might want to say more about this. But I think the ability to deploy X-ray capability in a patient's home or in the field, potentially is a significant game changer in terms of conveyance and the way we manage some patients. I don't think all you want to say there.
For me, this is a really exciting innovation and initiative that potentially will prevent people going into hospital unnecessarily. It's the first in the UK. So we're looking at the government, because obviously taking mobile X-rays out into the community, we need to have robust governance arrangements in place. But at the moment, the way the project is progressing, it looks really positive. We're looking at September, October to actually go to win, make sure that the government is doing to people's homes where there's potentially a fracture. We're not looking at fracture neck or femurs or anything like that. But actually, there's a potential fracture. Does this patient need to be transported or not? And then the film will go back then into the health board, where they'll be reviewed by the radiographer. So really exciting, really exciting. And there's a couple of things. Is the X-ray quality any good? I'm sure we can learn loads from the army in terms of what happens there, Kevin. So maybe we're just having a conversation with Kevin in terms of if there's any learning. And then there'll be an evaluation period. And so yeah, really exciting stuff.
Good. So
just add the remote activity is really very useful, as long as the backup system is robust. So the front end is great, but you need
the back end to do it.
But distance isn't a problem yet, so that's
thanks, Wendy. Next one, paragraph 56, if I can, just two final points I just want to draw out. So this is a leadership symposium which Andy and the team arranged in partnership with Trinity St David's, the University of Wales, Trinity St David's. There are about 100 of our people came together for a development day, and then the second paragraph connected to development of our people was 61, where Andy, you've run a couple of conferences for our advanced paramedic practitioners, and I wanted to just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the benefit from those.
Yeah, sure. As you said, we ran one north, one south, one in London, the other one in Swansea. Significant amount of interest of APPs, training APPs and prospective APPs as well. Over 100 attendees, a great deal of interest and some really good discussions. Met up with college afterwards. College were full of enthusiasm of what we were doing in terms of had us down as an example in terms of some of the practice that we're discussing and the way we're taking things forward. So really positive, but really generating a lot of interest.
Good stuff. Thanks, Andy. Then if I could take us to paragraph 68, please. The Bulls will be familiar with the fact that the UK government consulted recently on terms of reference for the national UK-wide public inquiry into management and response to COVID. Following that consultation, the Prime Minister has settled on the terms of reference, which now include specifically review of, through the inquiry, the 111 and 999 services. So the public inquiry in its first phase has actually begun and been opened. Trish and the team are leading work in preparing working out a timeline, but any further submissions that we may need to make to the inquiry as that progresses over the next couple of years. So that'll be a quick inquiry scope that it's got. But nonetheless, terms of reference are now settled. Of course, there is now a higher likelihood, given the change in terms of reference, that we could touch us, and therefore pushing to preparation there. And then the final point, Chairman, if I can, just before I take any questions, it's not in the paper, but the board will be familiar with and recall that in June we sadly saw the death of paramedic Robin Parry Jones in service. His funeral was held in early July, and a long-standing member of staff with us, who colleagues locally and clearly the team around his station will miss greatly. So, Chairman, I'll stop there and happy to take any questions on paper.
Thank you, Jason. Comprehensive report as always. I've imagined for an incoming chair incidentally, this is a very good lead to get up to speed quickly. So I imagine that'd be the pack for Colin to read early doors. Any questions or comments, Martin?
Sickness levels. It's on a number of items on the agendas today, and I noticed the first thing you talked about. I'd like to have a bit of a discussion about it, if you're happy to, Chairman. It's whether we do it now or with the other reports.
I think probably further on. Do you think, Jason? Is it think best under the
Bring it up.
mitigation or under the performance report?
Bring it into the performance report.
That's fine.
Yeah,
I'm
we
happy
won't
to-
lose it.
We'll pick it up then.
Obviously, to account for that.
Lovely. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Gary.
Thanks for the report, Jason. Really helpful as always. My question was on point 40 on calls and pilots that's been going on. So, you know, from what you're saying here, it seems there's really high impact and a positive impact in terms of conveyance. And I was just wondering about opportunities for where learning on that and roll out those projects.
Okay, I'll probably bring Wendy in to talk a bit more about it, Kerry. Thank you. So this is a scheme, obviously, which we've developed over the last couple of years and been funded directly by commissioners. We have extended in part through till March a nighttime service for Falls. Where we've still got some work to do here to kind of push up utilisation, if you like, or the benefit that the scheme offers. But it is something that we think it is necessary to continue. Hence, we've funded an additional nighttime service ourselves. But Wendy, you might want to just talk about kind of the structure of it and where it operates and how.
So it operates differently in a number of areas in terms of there's local variances across NHS, and it depends on how it's commissioned, how it can be funded. We know the benefit of having a Falls team is absolutely necessary, and commissioning arrangements are just difficult and challenging. So we need to respond to the local nuances, so not one size will fit all across NHS. So we have a comprehensive Falls package in a number of areas, but it is scalable and spreadable in terms of it just needs to be funded. There's funding opportunities there. We've got there's a piece of work that the team are doing, particularly the Falls team, with our own people's team as well, to look at what is building community resilience. And I think for me, in terms of we can look at commissioning services, but if you're in a rural area, actually you're going to need a different service if you're in the middle of Paris. So there's lots of models that we need to look at, Gary, but it's something that we are really working and pushing hard on.
And of course, it's part of our future ambition, isn't it, about less conveyance? Okay.
But I think for me, in terms, there's a piece of work that we need to look at around community resilience and policies and the role that they can actually have.
Just to add to that, Rachel, do you just want to comment briefly on the kind of commissioning arrangements that we've got for this? Because it's not a national fair.
Well, for the Falls, we had this probably a couple of years ago now, wasn't it? Through Healthier Wales funding, so every health organisation got an uplift to help it towards the aims of a Healthier Wales. So as far as I know, and Chris, you might be able to tell us definitively that money is now a standard part of our.
It
you know,
will
I
be,
don't think
obviously becoming the,
it's not going to be removed. So we found millions or something like it was
for the falls, but I think it was something like 700-800,000.
yeah, so it's a very big chunk, and I'm pretty sure we've got that permanently. The growth, as you say, if we want to grow it further, we would either have to prioritise that in our, you know, from within our own resources, or seek additional funding elsewhere.
Coincidentally, when I came up to Wrexham the other week, met the occupational therapist. A couple of people from the occupational therapy team were involved in this level 2 pilot. That seemed very close to be going ahead. I think as we discussed one issue about capital funding for vehicles that came to mind, but very strong commitment from Betsy to implement this one, which sounded promising. My question was about the care homes piece, because that's sounds like an extremely worthwhile initiative, because for many years we've bemoaned the fact we've raised the issue of differential 999 take up by care homes. Depending on a range of circumstances, this could also be a bit of a game changer, couldn't it?
It's a lot of policies and initiatives that we're looking at. Again, it's all at the early stages. There's lots of opportunity to improve vision and vision.
They're in the territory of the paper a bit further on about hanging on to improvement initiatives and scaling up. Okay, well, that was a good discussion. Any other comments on Jason's report? We're happy to, I think we just asked to note the report, aren't we?
We are.
Good. Okay, a lot going on. Well, let's move on then. I think that does lead us to the staff story, which of course we did endeavour to run last board meeting. Catherine, I think this is with yourself to introduce it, right, Paul? So over to you.
So if you remember the main board, I introduced Chloe Walkley and Cameron Bush, the two of our core managers who kind of talked in the video about some of their experiences in order to bring alive what the actual experience for our staff is as discussed really. So we weren't able to show it there. We did watch it as a group in board development in June, and I think we agreed that it was really important to show it again in this forum. And I think it's a tiny snapshot that brings alive the reality, and I think it's important to acknowledge that this is difficult not just for our staff but also for staff across the systems as well. Chloe is part of our peer support network, and so it's very keen to support the individuals in the concept particularly. And both of them were very creative last time, but they really loved the job and they wanted to do a good job. And I think that comes across in the video. So it's possible to work together.
I'm an EMD call handler. I work here in ambulance control, and I take the calls for 999 that come through to the whole of Wales.
I joined CCC last April in the middle of the pandemic. I was on furlough from my other job, so came here because I wanted to do something to help. I
do enjoy being able to help people, being able to arrange that help for them, give them any advice that we do on the phone.
I love working for us, I genuinely do. It's been hard and challenging, but I always go home and think I've done something worthwhile. I always think I've helped people. I've only been working during COVID, but even from what it was like in 2020, then compared to what it's been like the same point this year, it has been getting worse since before, so that has been harder on all of us. When you come into work at the start of the shift, and you can see how long the calls have been waiting there for, and then when you get people phoning back in and saying how long they've been waiting, and then you have to tell them that unfortunately they're going to be waiting even longer, you really have to grit your teeth when you do have to tell them sometimes how long they're going to have to be waiting. It's really not a pleasant experience. It's horrible, it's awful. It's coming in to try and help people and then telling them help's not available for a number of hours, or can you make your own way, or there is no help, is the complete opposite of what I came into the job to do. And especially when you've had a difficult call and then you get to that point where you've got to tell them. I know why we have to tell them, and I agree we should, but I dread it on every call. I start feeling upset getting to that point because I know that I'm going to tell them.
It can be hard when you've got callers that are pushing against you. We have our procedures that we need to go through with every 999 call, and we are always arranging that help for the patients.
Dealing with emergencies, listening to some really upsetting, sad, horrible, horrific stuff on times. Being there for someone in that moment where you've got to give them the instructions, try and keep them calm, try and help them as best you can, and then saying, it's going to be 6 hours, it's going to be 8 hours. I hate telling people that it's going to be 6 hours. It's not what I signed up to do. I wanted to join the service to help people, and then having to tell them there's no ambulance or it's going to be 6 hours, it makes me upset. And also just the duplicate calls, people calling in just for an ETA, and we do say, this is ETA, please don't call back just for the ETA. But when people are calling in then just for that and there's no change, we're watching calls poll because they're so busy. So we're looking at the board saying there's 15 calls waiting to be answered, but we're trying to deal with someone who's irate because they're just looking for an ETA.
Everyone in control and out on the roads, we are working as hard as we can, and we are trying to do our best for everyone that does phone into us, and we do try and get them the best possible help, whether that is in an ambulance or another forms of medical help. But every call is important to us, and we do try and get to everyone as quickly as we can.
I've had people say, I hope you see your mum in this situation and don't get an ambulance. I hope you don't get help when you need it. Thanks for nothing, etc. And I've come into work every day and worked harder during the pandemic. And then for people to act or seem as though I don't care is the worst thing, probably, because it's the complete opposite of that. Obviously, if I could tell everyone the ambulance will be there in 30 seconds, that would be what I'd want to do.
I think that speaks for itself, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think I should also add that I think we're grateful for people taking the time to hear their stories. And I think that's quite an important message that stuff sometimes don't always feel heard. So I think it's very
Let's throw it open to any comment. I think it's quite an emotional thing, actually. It does play into the discussion we're going to add next. But the best way to deal with it is actually to say, well, what can we do to make a difference as a board, isn't it? Paul?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up the issue about the help that we can provide as an organisation, because it is very emotional, it is hugely stressful. But over the last 3 to 4 years, we've strengthened the workflow that we have to support staff, and I think that's really important, particularly when you hear stories like that. I know our trade union colleagues have been very grateful from the investment that we've made in occupational health and other forms of support. I think that's really important as a board. We may not be able to change the system quite easily, but we can provide the support that staff need, and I think we've done that. So it is helpful to know that that's available. We talked that the people in culture committee how we make sure that people access the service, because sometimes people are struggling to don't access the service. So it's an issue for us about how we make sure that it's easy to access the service, people feel confident in it, and the service is responsive. And I think we continue to do that at committee level and obviously across the board.
Yeah.
I do wonder as well if that's reflected in the shift that we have in the sickness, the change in the long-term sickness thing, that people are recognising that they can access and are aware they can access their earlier. I think that that's that shift.
Yeah, could well be, couldn't it? I think you wanted to come into it.
Yes, please. I'd just like to say thank you to board for working at CCC and our other call centres, both one-on-one and then HSD. I suppose over the last few years we've concentrated a lot on the EMS side of things, but we need to realise that these are, I'd like to say, a forgotten service, that it does look like it has been a little bit of a forgotten service because they've been under immense pressure. And I'd like to thank Catherine and the team and Dr. Health for what they've put into the CCC and the other call centres.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know. Any other reflections? Somber atmosphere. Estelle?
I think I made this observation at the board development chair, but I'm really struck by how composed and professional they are for two quite young people early on in their career. And I think Paul's point and Hugh's point about the support that we offer is really well made, because those staff are at the start of their career, and what they experience now will shape their view both of the organisation and of the roles that they want to take up as they move forward in their careers. So it's really important, I think, that they do get that support, and they get a healing here, which, as Catherine says, is I think really important, because you know, that those experiences, and they're relentless, aren't they, day to day for some of our staff. That could completely switch them off an NHS career in its entirety, never mind a career working within our contact centres. So important that I think we thank them as a board for sharing that with us, and also assure them that they are heard and that we acknowledge their experience and that we are doing something to improve the experience of all our staff. But as Hugh says, you know, that is a different front line, isn't it? It's a different front line from our paramedics and emergency medical staff who are actually out there treating patients. This is first point of contact for people who are highly distressed, emotional, and in some cases, you know, to a point where they're abusive to our staff. And you understand when people are under pressure. Those are the guys and gals who have to deal with it firsthand. So just those observations.
Points well made, thank you, Estelle. So I think formally we should record those thanks to those two staff for coming forward with that sort of as a board. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. I think we saw this at Quest as well, and it was really powerful then. And in fact, it's more powerful when you see it the second time. I've got to say, I think the point Catherine makes around staff support and other colleagues have supported plays into the leadership challenge that, you know, our middle and sort of frontline leaders are facing in what could be a really attritional, what is potentially a really attritional challenge. And the fact that the sickness rates are coming down substantially plays to the support that you're describing. Catherine, you might want to say something about it, but I think, you know, the efforts behind the scenes, the upfront efforts, are far better placed than having to play catch up when things go dramatically wrong. So, you know, whatever we're doing is it's in the right direction, but we shouldn't lose track of those middle management leaders who face this attrition on a daily basis, and that the support to them is critical.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to just touch on a little bit around the support part, and I guess I've got a bit of a message actually internally for our own people. The themes that we've heard here aren't unique to this environment. There's an underlying theme that's really consistent, no matter, I think, really which staff group you speak to. And I agree that the support mechanisms have been put in place in the organisation. You know, I'm of a view we've got some of the best, and we're always open to hearing around what else we can do. But the key message I wanted to share was, you know, this brings to light very much the personal effects. You know, we have our organisational effects and impacts, which we're all very tuned into, but of course the personal impacts can be very different. There's no right or wrong in terms of personal impacts, but the message I wanted to talk about was actually not necessarily needing or having to wait until you are suffering before you're accessing or seeking supports. That these supports are a key prevention mechanism. And so I really want to encourage our people not to think that these are services and supports when you are suffering. Accessing early and not having any sense of shame or concern or worry about doing that may aid prevention. And the message from my management team is to be open to receiving, watching, identifying, and not being frightened to have those conversations about early access, because that's going to be key when we're tying that in with keeping our people at work happy and safe at work. So I just wanted to share that, Chair. I think that's a key internal point for our people.
And I think that's really well made. And I think normalising that view is the issue. That's normal behaviour, not, as you say, crisis, sort of seeking when a crisis has happened. So it's normal.
Absolutely support that. A message I think probably going to need to repeat at every opportunity, last slide and so on, because it's fundamental, isn't it, Martin?
I think the thing that came over to me in that, and one thing I worry about is that this becomes normal. But if, you know, Kevin just used this normalization word, you know, that our staff will be doing this next year or the year after and giving the same messages, and it becomes, you know, the whole NHS now. You try and go into A&E, you try and get a GP, waiting routinely for, there's a whole, you know, NHS issue here. And I think, you know, Estelle's probably quite good at this stuff. It's about these people are the message, these are the frontline people, aren't they, that are giving messages to our patients, to our public. And we need to support them, and they need to know, which was your point, I guess, that we are doing something about it. And that hopefully this isn't going to be something they come into work every day to do. At some stage, they will get the 8-second response that was talked about. So yeah, you know, that's an issue for us as a board, isn't it, to address, as well as listening to what staff are saying about their personal experience and how they feel about doing the jobs they're asked to do.
Doing something about it lies in the next report, doesn't it, in terms of the tangible action we can take.
Yeah, and it's important to get messages back to these people who are representing the organisation between us and the public, I guess. That,
Yeah.
you know, what's going on and that they are being listened to.
We certainly have been listened to and will continue to listen to. I think we're like minded on this, aren't we? We're harrowing video, the ball's in our court to decide actions that mitigate that experience for our staff. And I think your point is very strong about getting ahead of the curve, encouraging people to come forward before, not afterwards. Yeah, so we will record our thanks in minutes for those two staff for coming forward compared to their hearts, so to speak. And obviously we'll follow up on this in terms of the actions we're taking. I think that leads us on into the next item, if you're happy to do so. I note that Stephen Harry, Emergency Ambulance Services Commissioner, is now on the panel. So Stephen, I hope you can hear us okay.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
We're our sound check, actually, Stephen. So we will, thank you for joining us. We will weave you into this discussion. We're very grateful to you for joining us. This is obviously an important discussion, and it's really good that you're with us to hear it. I think rather than me set the scene, it's probably for you to do so. I think there's a clear trail in the report of the recommendations we need to cover. But I guess you might want to paint the picture by way of beginning. I'm going to take this report as read, but we've got 40 minutes allocated, which will go quickly.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So I'll just offer a brief introduction to the paper. I'm going to focus mainly on the annex, which of course is the actions, so the things we're actually doing about, or we can do about the problem. Just before I start talking, as colleagues are offering contributions as we go through the rest of the board, I should remind colleagues to project and speak up, so that there's some sound challenges for members of the public listening to the proceedings today. So if we can project and try and keep a lot louder voice, we're offering contributions, that would be helpful to those listening remotely. So this paper before us touches on actions to mitigate in real time, if you like, avoidable harm that we are aware is occurring as a result of sustained pressure across the system. The board will remember that we've discussed this issue on a number of occasions before, and this paper seeks to bring together, particularly in the annex, the range of interventions and actions that have taken place, both of those actions that we've got in hand ourselves and those which the system are taking in response to the challenge before all of us, because this is a partner issue across the whole event of the NHS and indeed social care, not simply one for us. And I'll ask Stephen, as you've said, Chair, has joined us, to talk in a bit more detail when we get to the annex about the system actions that are underway, because Stephen is much closer to the management of those with health board partners. So I suppose as a quick summary of where we find ourselves, it's best probably to look at the first couple of paragraphs in the situation section of the paper. Essentially what we've seen over time, and as a consequence of additional pressure and disruption across the system created by the pandemic, what we have seen a substantial growth in lost capacity from our fleet, peaking at about a third of the entire emergency response fleet earlier this year, and it fluctuates between 25 and 30% of the entire fleet each month. As a consequence of that and other inefficiencies in the system, some of which are matters for us to resolve, such as the efficiency we know we need to deliver through roster change, which was identified in the demand and capacity review from 2019, which we will deliver commencing in September over a 3-month period, which will give us an efficiency equivalent to 72 people, 72 whole time. So that's one issue that will contribute to improvement that is within our control, as is the issue of attendance, which we touched on in my report prior to this, and we'll return to in the performance section later on. We have that trajectory of improvement which we've agreed, which is in the IMTP over the life of the IMTP, to get us back to the pre-pandemic levels of attendance of about 6.5%. And as I touched on earlier, just rehearsing it for this particular point, we started the year, the financial year at the end of March, beginning of April this year at about 15%. We're now at 9.2 in June. That is consistent with the trajectory we set ourselves, but there is much more work we have to do on attendance. And other areas of efficiency that contribute to improvement that are in our control are things such like the heal and treat rate, and stretching ourselves to that and the internal ambition we have of 15%, which is, we're delivering daily or routinely now 12, 13, 14%. So a little bit of a stretch to get to that initial kind of milestone ambition, internal ambition we set ourselves at 15%. And of course, we know, the new service model and inverting the triangles work that we've got underway seeks to stretch that much further, because that's yet to come. So there is some work which is most definitely within our control, which will help and contribute to improvement. And we've got plans underway, as I've just described, on those 3 areas. But then we've been working with the rest of the system on improvements that they can make. We'll come to those later. We've clearly been seeking to maximise production, and this is covered in paragraph 5. So, there's been essentially unrestricted overtime, but of course we have to be careful here about, burnout and staff well-being. And we've sought to also support production through additional third-party capacity from partners across Wales, and I'll say a bit more about that later. Figure 1, so the first chart in the paper, figure 1 at the top of page 4, essentially I think is quite a strong and powerful graphic. What this shows you in the blue line is the decaying position, amber median performance over time, and you can see there the direct correlation between that and the pressure that's emerging across the rest of the system and impacting our ability to respond to patients in the community. And that's the lost capacity of emergency departments. And as that's increased over time, capacity has been lost, and therefore response times to patients in the community have decayed. And Chairman, I just want to say at this point again, I say this every time, but I want to apologise to those patients in the community that have waited longer than they and we would like over recent months for the poor level of service they've experienced. If I then, I think, move forward in the paper, noting that colleagues will have read it, it does begin to draw out the impact on our people, this concept of moral injury, or the concept of moral injury, the inability of our people to do the work that they've trained and joined for. And that, we've just heard in the staff story an example of that for colleagues in our clinical contact centres, but of course that's true across EMS and the front line, the response front line too. So there is a real, challenge for our workforce in this, in as much as they are unable to undertake the roles that they've joined and trained for, and that is adding pressure to our sickness and attendance challenge, particularly with, when we break down sickness and attendance, we've seen increases in stress and anxiety, which we can point directly to as a consequence of the workplace experience environment currently. So I think if I can, then turn to some of the key touch points in paragraph 15, since we last discussed this as a board, and what's happened then. So on the 8th of June, Martin, you touched on this in your chair's introduction. On the 8th of June, the Director General of the Health and Social Services Division of Government, and also, as the board will be familiar, who's also the Chief Executive of the NHS, convened a meeting of all of the chairs and chief executives of the health boards, where this issue was further ventilated in some detail, and a number of immediate actions were agreed, and I'll come to those in Annex 1. After that, on the 23rd of June, there was a further meeting, but this was with the Health Minister and chairs and chief executives, and again, further discussion of this and other issues of pressure across the NHS, and the commitment, if you like, a further commitment to those original actions from the 8th of June. On the 1st of July, the Emergency Ambulance Services Committee, or the chair and the Chief Ambulance Services Committee on the Chief Ambulance Services Commissioner on behalf of the committee met with our three chairs, as you touched on, Martin, you and I, and then on the 6th of July, you and I met with Health Improvement Wales, meet Martin, to discuss the issue essentially with the regulator here in Wales too. So if we go to Annex 1, I'm not going to go through all of the actions that we've got here in detail for each of them. But I'm just going to pull out some of the highlights, and I suspect in conversation we will also touch on others. So at that meeting on the 8th of June, and then subsequently reinforced by conversation and the meeting with the Minister, we've now agreed, and actually it went live on Monday this week, new arrangements for immediate release directions. So this is where we have a red or an amber 1 call in the community that we are unable to respond to because we don't have a vehicle, and that resources are being held at the emergency departments. Commitment has now been given by the chief executives across all health boards in Wales that they will immediately release a vehicle from the emergency department to respond to that call in the community. A new protocol has been agreed and distributed. That took effect from Monday this week. It's got real-time escalation arrangements in it should a rejection of a direction to release a vehicle occur, right through to on-call directors in the health board by our team. And we are providing performance data against compliance to both Welsh Government and health boards on a week in arrears basis, so we can monitor the improvement of compliance to those immediate release directions. It's fair to say that we've seen improvement in red compliance, but there is a bit of a way to go in the amber 1 compliance since those arrangements have been recorded. The board will be familiar through other conversations that we've been supported by government with a further £3 million worth of non-recurrent money this year. That will support the recruitment of 100 additional frontline staff, which will be deployed, will commence training in September, and it will be deployed through December and January. So December this year through to January 2023. Largely emergency medical technicians through direct entry, some ACA2 colleagues, but of course there'll be complexity the board will appreciate in how that flows through the existing workforce, but essentially it's growth of 100 people supported by £3 million worth of additional non-recurrent investment from government this year. And then we need to settle the recurrent tail of that with commissioners from the 1st of April, and Stephen will support us in that endeavour. So that's good news. Yeah, that's good news, and further growth, and does bring over the last 2 and a bit years now growth in frontline patient-facing services to about 400 people. But the point, of course, to make is that you know, in the same period, we've seen additional activity over and above that which we expected to see in the demand capacity review, and we've also seen changes in the system around us. So the additional capacity that we've had has actually been lost through other factors, not necessarily within our control. Item 3 talks about a bid that we had into the value-based healthcare fund for an additional 50 advanced paramedic practitioners. Since this paper was initially written, we have now received confirmation that that bid has regretfully been rejected. So we are unable to proceed with the recruitment of an additional 50 advanced paramedic practitioners. Of course, that's somewhat disappointing because it does begin to tie our hands in the transformation agenda, but of course other avenues do remain open, and I will be discussing further with government how we are to proceed with the transformation agenda, given that the rejection of that bid. I touched on roster reviews earlier. This is a very complex and detailed piece of work which has been going on for many months. It's now kind of coming to the crescendo, if you like. It will commence with new rosters being implemented in September in West Wales, and then roll out over a 3-month period. So by the end of November, all of the new rosters will be implemented. I do just want to thank trade union colleagues for support, because this is very detailed and very emotive at a local level. So we've had to tread carefully and work through this very carefully, rightly in partnership with trade union colleagues and the staff that are going to be working rosters. And of course, the board will remember that we've actually said to staff locally, we want them to design the rosters that they are going to be working as an important feature of this. So that will go live commencing in September, which is good news, and offer, as I touched on earlier, that significant efficiency, which will help and which will contribute to improvement here. We touched on the improvement trajectory for attendance twice already, and we'll touch on it again as we get to the performance report. So I won't say much more about that here. We've got work underway, discussions underway on post-production lost hours. There's 2 things that this action here seeks to draw out. Of course, the board will remember, certainly through the discussions in committee, that there are some post-production lost hours which are entirely legitimate and necessary for operational reasons, such as cleaning a dirty vehicle, changing a dirty uniform, returning to base to restock after resuscitation, all those kind of things. They are legitimate post-production lost hours. But there are others that we've got work underway in 2 tranches really to improve. There's a task and finish group that Lee's directorate are running to seek to find ways to reduce those other hours we can control. And indeed, data I saw earlier this week suggests improvement in the overall post-production lost hour losses on a month-on-month basis over the last 4 or 5 months. So that's pleasing to see. And then the other area that we're discussing, we're locked into active discussions about with trade union colleagues, is what we may be able to do to support a reduction in end-of-shift overruns, so the frequency and duration of end-of-shift overruns for frontline staff, because that is a particular frustration for colleagues at the moment. The latest data suggesting about 1 in 3 shifts overruns by nearly an hour. So we do have to try and get into this. And the connection here with post-production lost hours is what we may be able to do to offer improvements around break arrangements that also support improvements in end-of-shift lost hours. So there's active discussion going on to try and find ways to get into that. And more on that, I think, as those discussions develop, in the next few weeks. Consultant close, we've touched on 14% on a daily basis at the moment. An internal ambition to stretch that to 15%. We're pretty confident we'll get to that point very soon. So the training for the rollout of ECNS is due to conclude imminently. And once that's concluded, of course, that creates, it's necessary to create abstraction from the workforce to undertake that training. Once that training on the new system being used in the clinical support desk is concluded, the system is obviously in and operating. We will remove MTS, and then we're pretty confident that once we've got that stabilised, we'll then be able to hit that 15% internal ambition, recognising, of course, that the efficiency that was identified for us in the D&C review was 10.2%, which we are exceeding. System influencing appears at point 8. We've covered this. This is the meetings, essentially key meetings with stakeholders across the system. ODU we know about, REAP we know about. We've agreed with Stephen's support to run a targeted recruitment campaign to grow our community first responders, so to recruit and grow community first responders, particularly here with reference to response performance in rural areas. So this is seeking to improve performance in rural areas or reduce variation in performance in rural areas, and that work is underway now with the team actively engaged in that, developing that recruitment campaign. Serious avoidable harm and reporting we know about. Lots of discussions with the Chief Medical Officer in government and the Chief Nursing Officer. Discussions with the delivery unit around the Appendix B method of transferring cases from us across the health calls where we've identified avoidable harm, and regular sharing of data around avoidable harm trends and themes from our quality director into health calls too. The board will be familiar with the submission we made to the Senate Health and Social Care Committee, and of course they're now reported. There's a series of recommendations, and one of those recommendations touches directly on us. Well, not on us, it does touch directly on us, but it's a matter for the government to respond to in terms of actions they're taking to reduce delays in handover emergency departments. We'll hear more later about the 111 awareness campaign, which Estelle and others have been involved in. Emergency department cohorting does still continue, although we are currently evaluating the value of emergency department cohorting to assess whether that would be something that we would believe is reasonable to continue. I'm open to dialogue with Stephen on that. Once we've concluded that evaluation, we'll determine whether it's right to continue with cohorting at the 2 sites it currently operates on. We've got third-party capacity in, and there'll be more of that coming to support production in the coming weeks. We did, as the board will be familiar, submit a plan in December last year, seeking to recruit nearly further 300 staff. That has yet to be endorsed formally by commissioners. Of course, we have subsequently had, as I've just touched on in the previous action, an additional financial support and 100 additional people coming in across the next 6 months or so. So we do have growth in the workforce. I've touched on the overnight extension to calls already in the previous report. And I think the final thing there, just to touch on, is that we are continually looking at and using our improving forecasting capability to identify where particular pinch points are and what management intervention we can take to mitigate where we can harm that's occurring, also for patient experience and for staff experience that's underway. So that's a quick canter through the internal actions that appear at Appendix 1. Chairman, I'll probably pause there and perhaps take any comments or questions that the board has got on those before we turn to the system actions, which I will run through, then ask Stephen to support contributions.
Brandon then Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, one of the issues in the recommendations around all reasonable steps would be, are we comparing ourselves with what is happening across the rest of the UK? Because obviously this is a national problem at the moment. And I'm sure all the execs that tied into their respective groups. What I would say is that the medical director at NASMED has met regularly over this period and has actually held a couple of emergency meetings given the scale of the problem. And I think that the steps that we've taken are comparable to what is happening across the rest of the UK. There's nothing that seems to be outstanding in any area of England that we haven't explored or we're not implementing. People are obviously aware that this is a situation that's affecting emergency and scheduled care across the whole of the UK, and it was interesting that the new minister has called for a series of urgent hackathons today regarding the ambulance waiting times. The one area that I think that possibly England are slightly ahead is in some of the secondary care aspects, where in some areas the same-day emergency care and urgent primary care centres are probably slightly more advanced than we've seen in some parts of Wales. But in terms of the internal actions, I would say that we are doing at least as much as any of the others compared across the UK from the information that I've received, and obviously recently picked up through AAs. Also, there's been quite a major CQC workshop on urgent and unscheduled care. And again, the same points have come up. And I would say that we have been acting on those. But the one area that is a little disappointing, because I think that we do have the potential to lead on, given the evidence that we've been able to demonstrate so far, is the advanced paramedic practitioner rollout. And I'm convinced that if we were able to initiate that at the scale that is required, that would probably be the most significant area of improvement that we could do internally. Across the UK, I think it's probably us and London that have been leading. And I think that because of the work that we initiated in North Wales, we've probably got more extensive and robust evidence on the impact of the APPs on the system. So it was just to make that point in terms of, are we taking more reasonable steps compared with other UK ambulance services?
Thanks, Frank. That's a helpful expansion of Jason's introduction. I think it's Paul, you next. Then.
Yeah, it's picking up the theme about APPs, and I just wonder, do we know why it was rejected, the bid? And secondly, we've got significant evidence, as Brendan has said, around the effectiveness of APPs. And I just wonder what other funding streams. So, for example, where's the Primary Care Development Fund? Are we able to access that? Because it is a pre-hospital primary care service.
Yeah.
So that's one question. The second one is around the fit to sit. It seems to be taking a long time to develop a protocol for something that, from my past experience, is quite simple to implement. So I just wonder where that is in the process.
So perhaps I'll ask Wendy to talk about fit to sit, because she's been much closer to that with the Chief Nursing Officer and other directors of nursing across the health boards on the bid. So we've only found out in the last couple of days. So found out they've been notified. That's a better way to describe it. They've been notified in the last couple of days that it's been unsuccessful. And that's been a brief letter, essentially brief correspondence saying, sorry, we have been unsuccessful. We had a discussion yesterday about how we now follow up on that. And we will be, both in terms of understanding the nature of those bids which have been successful against the 5 million pots available, recognising, of course, that prior to that 15 million was also made available to health ring-fence health colleagues for value-based healthcare initiatives. What is becoming, what I think this latest rejection of a bid is a little bit more concerning for me, Paul, is that it's on the back of others which have also been rejected for us. So I'm thinking here about other bids we've made earlier this year, the 25 million for urgent emergency care for argument's sake and so on. So I do think now we're approaching a point where there is a conversation necessary with government colleagues and the system at large. Stephen is hearing this from me cold for the first time, but I do think there is now a conversation which is becoming necessary about how we, as a service, access transformation into more funds. Because whilst I recognise we have had investment of 3 million on an unrecovered basis is a good example. What is becoming increasingly clear is that we are unable to access pots of money that are made available to support transformation, innovation and change, which health board colleagues have access to, which we don't. And I think that's becoming problematic for us.
I think that's my point really, Jason. If it's the model that's not acceptable, then we could work on that. If it's because of the type of service we provide, that's different. And I do think that we do need to understand how we better access those funding streams, because we don't seem to be able to.
So just quickly, thank you, Chair, thank you, Paul. Yeah, so just to add to what Jason said there, so yeah, as we talked about this literally last night, in terms of how we respond, because it is recent and it is a short-term sort of rejection letter, if you like. So we are going to ask for a little bit more detail as well, because we'd like to understand, we want to understand the criteria which our bid was assessed and was not considered to be against maybe perhaps one of the two of the others that have been successful, and what we can learn from that potentially as well, but also understanding some of that. But yeah, it is that wider piece. As you say, it's not just some of the things that we'd expected to be funded. We know last year we put into place some items on a recurrent basis which were expected to be funded from certain pots. This year, the 25 million, as Jason's referenced, but it's also knowledge of a reasonable amount of money that is probably being made available to health boards. It's the 15 million that we referenced for value-based healthcare. There's been a really fairly substantial amount for COVID recovery, which is either items which we are not able to submit bids for, be considered for, or because of commissioning arrangements, there's maybe an assumption that we get recognised through the health board commissioning arrangements in some aspects, which in some ways we are, but in others we're not. And that's before we get into other specific pots, but it's primary care, mental health, which is automatically almost considered as not relevant to us, but is relevant to us. So we're gonna sort of explore a bit of that, no doubt through Stephen, but also possibly directly with government as well, and almost come up with a little bit of a list of these are the things that are in the allocation letter for this year that we haven't been able to have any kind of access to, or haven't flowed through to us, or subsequent amounts that have sat available that either we have expressed interest in for and have now been supported, or that we haven't even been able to get access to the bidding for in the first place, and share some of that, because it is, yes, it's becoming a challenge.
I'll come back on this in a minute, theoretically, but there we are. Karen.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry, Wendy.
Yeah,
Wendy.
Just very quickly on the criticism. So myself and Andy have met with some of the nurse directors across NHS Wales to look at the criticism. Very supportive in terms of how we can actually make that happen. I know the EDQF team are actually also doing a piece of work, so we're working in collaboration with those. I think the question you posed, Paul, is really important in terms of you would think it was quite a simple thing to actually implement, but it's around changing culture for the clinical colleagues in ED. So it's probably not as simple as we thought it was, but it's in terms of the process. I've got the alternative pathway up here already been doing, so we're all ready to go with it. It's just trying to encourage our colleagues.
So where are we likely to get then, do you think?
Absolutely.
When?
Oh, when? To be honest, I've got a meeting with Julian and the team in the next couple of weeks in the EDQF team, because for us, we need to have this implemented really quickly, and it's a really simple process.
Yeah, the concern is we'll be starting to think about when we're planning, and this could be a significant support for us.
So I would be anticipating September at the latest.
Thanks.
Keep your voices up, folks.
Yes, thanks.
Carrie.
Thank you. I really welcome the focus on this. I think it's so important, and in Finance and Performance Committee and Quest, we really discussed this at length, and which actually was really hard and quite upsetting, particularly around the harm. So my question is, in the context of this appendix, how a lot of this is operational detail, and for us as a board, it's not our role to get into the operational detail, but this is so important. And you know, we're seeing the harm. We've talked about the welfare of our staff. This is, you know, really important for us to have an oversight of. So where does, you know, where are we going to see progress? But particularly, I'm more interested in where we're not making progress. If it's a good example of that. And Stephen's going to be talking to us next. I did have a very specific question on points 21 and 22 in the plan, which have no plan delivery date. It just said to be concerned. Now, I appreciate how difficult they are to deliver, and some of us were in an ED department yesterday and hearing about, you know, when that call comes through to release an ambulance, actually they're also trying to escalate internally and the challenges around that. So I'm not suggesting, you know, this is easy, but I do think as a board, you know, we need to see some specifics around this, and we need to have a process in respect of how we monitor this going forward.
I mean, on 21 and 22, I'll Stephen to comment more when we get to that section, Kerry, if I can. I mean, you know, obviously, I mean, this paper seeks to bring together all of the things that we've got going on, which we've enacted or asked the system to do to support us in reducing avoidable harm. I mean, I've been at pains, as I've said through the presentation of the paper, there is some stuff we can do, and there is some stuff we need the system to do. So, yeah, to effect an improvement for patients and our people, all of these things need to come together. What we do know, because we've modelled this, is the totality of all the things that we can do aren't sufficient to get us back to a reasonable position. So it has to be a genuine system effort. Where we deliver improvement in efficiency, rosters, attendance, you know, systems and processes that we have, and that the system produces efficiency, reduces the lost hours, gives us greater access to, you know, alternatives, supports us to change the service model and so on. So all of these things do need to come together.
Okay, we go to Kevin and David, and then we'll go to yourself. Then we'll go to Stephen.
Thank you. I think Kerry brings a really important point here. Notwithstanding their terms of reference, the Quality Committee, People and Culture, Finance and Performance Committees all met in sequence, which has brought us to this paper today. And the chairs of those three committees escalated their concerns around all of the issues Jason has gone through in detail to the chair. And hence we have this paper in an open session today. We very much welcome the meeting with the chair of East and with Stephen. But on 21 and 22, Kerry, specifically, we have to be very careful that we don't think this is good, because it's a welcome trajectory, but that's all it is at this point in time. It's not good. It still puts patients in temporary clinical environments, which are by definition over a point of time risky, or risk increases over time in temporary clinical environments. And the risks are there in terms of the moral injury we talked about with regard to staff and to patients, and the deterioration that happens as a consequence. So we've got to be very, very careful about how we consider 4 hours and 25%. You know, on Wendy's point around fit to sit, you know, I just find it difficult to understand how something culturally is stopping an intervention. And I do come back to the DEU report where they use the term learned helplessness. And I think that's a challenge for our healthcare colleagues, and if we can help them with it, we certainly ought to try and do that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Yes, it's a small point. Just to say, you know, obviously great to hear that there's an agreement now with the health boards regarding the red release
But just to bring it to the attention and be mindful that the stresses that are involved in this system, from a crew perspective, being prepared in the station ready to go is completely different to trying to rush somebody off a vehicle which you've been treated. So just mindful, we're going to be under scrutiny, we're going to be looking at it, but we've got to be mindful that these crews are not acting in a normal way by rushing somebody off, hoping that everything's ready to go to something else, which is probably going to be more stressful.
Point well made, thank you. My point was a challenge to ourselves, really. So this report is here because we've established a clear correlation between delayed access to emergency care, whether slow response in the community or patient not ambulance, clear correlation between delayed access and patient harm. The evidence is inescapable. In terms of our internal actions, we come up against money. So my question is, were money no object, which of those things that we can't do would we take and do in one order? Because I think we've then got a genuine conversation to be had about budget versus decisions on those things as an organisation. Because the danger is we externalise this and say this is all down to what other organisations have to do. I mean, except they do have to do things, they should be held to account for that. But equally, there's a legit challenge to ourselves, unpopular it may be, to say, okay, if budget were no object, what would we do? Because we've expressed this, for example, the NVP thing. But without going into detail, I'm thinking, well, what's the cost implication if we were to proceed at risk? What would EASC say about us proceeding at risk? What backing might we get? I take all your points, Jason, about access to funding sources. I think that's a legit line of inquiry. But is it going to be the money or the quality? It's one of those very awkward situations for me, which I think we may need to return to.
Martin, can I
this is not end of term, not April. This is being serious, because we saw this in mid-Stafford, but we're allowed to say that.
I think the question is a good one, and I also think that we could add to that. It was something we were talking about last night, and I'll talk about it now. It's, well, if this is going to be a long-term situation, would we do things differently, or are we treating this as a temporary issue that will be resolved? And I think there are two questions, because I think that we're treating it as a temporary situation that will be resolved. Would we do something different if we thought this is a long-term situation? In other words, for example, would we start taking people home and not having them waiting 6, 7, 8 hours in ambulances? Would we look to take them home and get them treated and looked after at home and send the ambulances out on other calls? Because everything we're doing, we made this point last time, everything we're doing by being better is just increasing the queue at the hospital. Kerry and I and others went to Paul was there yesterday, and we were told there were 90 patients in Wrexham Mile. I don't know if that's right or not, but it's probably near enough to understand the problem. There are 90 patients there who were waiting to be discharged. Now, unless that's resolved,
it's an ongoing.
It's going to be here for years. So I'm wondering, if we asked the question of the ambulance service, and said, would we do something different if this is a permanent situation or a long-term situation?
Does it relate to my
would we, which is related to your point, because we do have a lot of money. Giving us extra money mightn't make it better. It just means we can respond quicker and get people into a queue quicker, but it isn't going to solve the problem for the patient.
Flurry of hands. I'm going to give Jason the right to come in first, because he's probably deeply uncomfortable.
No.
As the accountable officer of the money.
I'm deeply uncomfortable with knowingly breaking our statutory financial duties. But the challenge about is it money or is it quality? Is it good challenge? Of course, what we know is throwing more money at the problem in the same way that we currently are is not necessary.
Yeah,
so that, well, actually, it's
it's
not
got to be. Which is why I said those things that would make the biggest impact.
It's not a solution. So to give you a scale of the quantum that would be necessary to mitigate the scale of loss that we currently, or the inefficiency that we have in the system currently, we're talking about north of 400 more people on top of the numbers I've already spoken about. And that would require stations, and it would require vehicles. We can't get those people into the current state, and then they would join a queue. So more ambulances. I'm really clear on this. More ambulances is just not the answer.
But I didn't say it was.
No. I'm not saying. I'm playing out my response.
Okay,
playing out my response. So I'm really clear that lots more ambulances is just not the answer to this. It has to be about change, transformation, and doing it differently. It has to be. It absolutely has to be. Because if colleagues across health and social care are able to get back to where we need to be, 6,000 hours a month or less, or turning around in 15 minutes, as we should be doing. That is a long term trajectory to get to that point. We'll talk about trajectories for improvement in a minute because they do now exist. We've seen them and they do now exist, and I'll ask Stephen to talk about those in a second. But it's going to be a long burn to get to that point where the system is able to deliver that level of improvement on a sustained basis. And what we also know, and Andy might want to say more about this, as the professions develop, now people have developed, as we've got increasing skills that we can deploy, and as we've got increasing evidence of what's happening with the patients that we are conveying, we increasingly know that a load of patients that will totally moved to the department could safely be dealt with in the community. And patients tell us they want to be near their support network, in their community, in their homes. And we also know that taking people into an institution where you don't need to do so creates additional risk of exposure to hospital-acquired infections and all sorts of other things. So I suppose what I'm saying, Martin, a long-winded answer, I suppose what I'm saying is, I think this is a medium to long-term challenge, Martin. It's not a short-term issue. And even if it were a short-term issue, I think the right thing to do is to continue to change the service model, because doing what we're currently doing, now, as each day goes by, there is more and more evidence that says what the model that we currently operate is not as efficient and effective as it could be if we treated more patients closer to home, closed the episode of care where we could, and crucially avoided
So you've answered my point directly in the sense that the action plan contains a number of transformative actions, such as the APPs. So you're actually saying those would be the things that you would pick out.
So if
the transformative things, rather than do more of the same thing, which is more truck staff.
Yes.
Which is where I am. So we're in the same place. I'll let the other two colleagues come in, Chris and then Andy.
Just quickly, thank you. So just I'm about to comment on the money bit, aren't they? So not that I'm, we've had this conversation before, and welcome it again, and just for colleagues to be aware, I've also in a private session, amongst friends, but I've raised it in discussions at peer directors of finance or government colleagues to say that we're having this conversation. Not we've agreed or we're looking to do anything specifically from a money perspective necessarily, but those conversations are happening. So and that balance of financial risk against quality and safety risk is obviously paramount to our debate. But I think the other things to put in context to that would be you mentioned obviously we'd have to commissioner's view, but there's a government angle on this as well. And you mentioned obviously as Jason as clinical officer, that relationship directly with government, and that would be a key stakeholder in that discussion as well. Should that be the case? And we can't lose sight of the national NHS Wales financial picture at the minute, forecast for this year and beyond in that context in any of that discussion. Just on your point about doing things at risk, I would argue we do quite a bit at risk actually, and have done more recently. Last year we committed quite a lot of recurrent resource at risk. We had to pull a bit of it back at the start of the year then because we didn't get the recurrent support to do it. The staff we're putting in now, we've mentioned, that's all, we've only got that £3 million doesn't buy 100 staff. Now nowhere near it, you need twice as much as that on a full year recurrent basis. So if I point in 100 staff now permanently out of the 3 million non-recurring pot of money available to us this financial year is at risk at the minute until we sort out the recurrent and whether that's an exit strategy from it or the recurrent funding to support that going forward. And finally, just to underpin the transition step, I was going to pick it up this briefly in my finance paper a bit later. We'll see some of the work we started on a financial sustainability work stream, which has got a number of work streams within it, looking at various ways of which we can, predominantly or primarily was focusing on future years efficiency, savings programs, cost reduction, cost avoidance, but also we've got work in there around how we perhaps generate more income, but also how we use the money that we've got. Picking up Martin's point, we've got a lot of money. We never do this, do we? We never look at the start of it and say, great stuff, we've got 280 million to spend this year, we're going to spend it. It's all, we haven't got the 10 million that we needed. So it's about how we spend the money differently and how we transform the existing resource as well as additionality to do things differently. So a key strand of that financial sustainability work stream now will also be about underpinning our wider transformation agenda and how we use that to deliver on some of that as well. So there's a lot going on, but just needed to sort of put those contexts in as you would expect me to.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's good whole, isn't it? I appreciate that, thank you. Andy, then we'll get to the other bit.
I mean, no discussion that involves me tends to go without the mention of APPs, does it really, in respect to this? So I'm glad others have kind of teed me up in regard to the subject. But our APPs in recent years have now attended 60,000 patients. We have consistently shown their conveyance rate is between 30 to 40% less than conventional resources. We have more evidence than we could ever require to say this is a game changer in terms of the ability for us to really affect patient care. In terms of Martin questions, whether this is a short-term problem or a long-term problem, and the nature of the reasons people call 999 has changed. It ain't going to go away as our population continues to age. And so those are the patient groups that we're going to be looking to see, not just now, but it's going to grow the year after and the year after that, and the year after that. If we continue to be commissioned and aim to deliver as a conveyance resource, a traditional ambulance service, we are going to get further and further into this mire that we are currently in. We have to transform, we have to do things differently. Now, like I said, there is a real debate to have in terms of do we blow the bank to help us transform this way? How much support can we draw in from other parts of the health economy to help us transform? But the reality is, whichever way we play this, we have to transform, because otherwise we are simply going to drown under what's coming down the track. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Chair, I've only got a very additional comment to make in relation to this, because I don't think the balance here is simply between money and quality. If we have to look at transformation for ourselves, and I know you've touched on access to transformation funds, the reality, sadly, I think will be, if we have to do this ourselves within the gift we have, there will be a further short-term impact on delivery and quality, because we're going to have to remove in order to upskill, reskill, and that's going to result in a further deterioration in the quality and timeliness of delivery that we're currently providing. And to contemplate a worsening position from now is, well, frightening. So we've not only got that balance between the money, and of course, you know, Chris, quite right, how do we use the budget annually? If left to do it unenabled, and I think that's what perhaps I'm alluding to, transformation has to be enabled, because the capacity doesn't exist within our current setting, because our current setting is all hands to the pump to deliver the most timeliest and effective service we possibly can in the environment we're in. And if the environment's not going to change and we aren't enabled, there's a financial balance and a further potential for quality deterioration before it then gets better. And that's going to be a real challenge for us.
Okay, that's a picture. We want to go on to the second part. I think there's a couple of hands gone up, but we'll run this to the break, this discussion, which is way at the time, but I'm afraid we're going to keep this until we get to the recommendation, so to speak, and I lose my voice.
Okay, thanks, Chairman. So, if we go to the second part then, and I'll just quickly canter through the system actions that are noted from 21 onwards, but then ask Stephen to come in and add some depth to them. And Stephen, when I do that, perhaps you could just comment also first on the breadth of the actions that we've got underway from your perspective. I'm sure you'll agree, you know, there's a lot there. But are they the right things? Are they reasonable from your perspective? I think that view would be helpful. So on the system actions, if we go to 21 first, as has rightly been identified already in discussion, we have agreed, or there is an agreement with the system. Initially, this originated in October last year at an EASC meeting, where a reduction of losses to emergency department handover delays of 25% 1 quarter would be delivered. So a commitment was made to reduce ED handover delays by 25%. It's not touched on in this paper because they have been developed and agreed and endorsed by EASC since this paper was initially written. But there are now improvement trajectories for each of the emergency departments, which have been, as I've just said, been through EASC. So we know what improvements are expected to be delivered at each emergency department. What we're now doing as a result of that is some simulation modelling to say, with those improvements and our improvements, what's that going to equal in terms of patient experience and response performance. So that modelling is underway. We'll have that in the next 10 days or so. Now we've got those improvement objectives on a national basis. In addition to that 25%, there was also agreement by chief executives of health boards that we'd have a 4-hour backstop. And essentially what that means is that no patient would wait in the back of an ambulance for more than 4 hours. Now, Stephen and I have had some really helpful, I think, further discussions on this in the last week or so, because there is a connection between this and the immediate release direction piece. Because if we bring down the number or the volume of very long waits that are occurring in the emergency department, not only is that better for those patients clearly in the back of those ambulances and for the staff with those patients, it also means that there is a higher likelihood of the fleet being available, and therefore there should be less immediate release directions being made. So there is a direct connection between the two. We'll be reporting on this measure too in a new live dashboard, which will make available with quality measures this week. Will be made available, this made available this week to health boards. So this will be visualised live to colleagues. The next one, 23, is the work that we've colloquially kind of called the 1,000 beds work. So this is across NHS Wales as a shared endeavour with local authorities and social care to create capacity equivalent to 1,000 beds. And the 1,000 beds number essentially comes from the number of medically fit discharge patients which are held in the acute setting across Wales every day. It varies, but it's about 1,000, 1,200 or so. So the aspiration here is to develop that capacity or different capacity equivalent to 1,000 beds by October. And that's being led by one of the health board chief executives across the system. We've then got Fit to Sit, which we've touched on already, so I won't speak more about that. And same day emergency care, which we also know about. So this essentially is where our people will have referral rights into same day emergency care to avoid the emergency department. There's a nationally agreed criteria for what patients can and can't go to ESTEC facilities. They're not rolled out in every health board yet, but they are coming as part of the 6 goals for emergency care work. So we've got ESTEC referral capabilities coming. And then the final one, which isn't in here as an action, but I've touched on it, is the creation of the improvement trajectories for each of the EDs, which went through at its last meeting. So Stephen, can I invite you, if I can, thank you again for joining us today. Could I ask you to talk about, your perspective on our actions and the breadth of those, and in your perspective, whether they are the right things, and then could you just add a bit more depth to the system actions for us?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. And thanks very much for the invite to come along and participate in this part of your meeting. It's much appreciated. And it's a very important paper that you've placed into the system. I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. Chair, I won't, I guess you don't want me to comment about the broader conversation that you just had, but to pick up the action plan, but obviously I'm happy to give you my perspective on that broader conversation if you wish me to. But for the moment, I'll just concentrate on the action plan as you've asked me to do. In terms of the action plan is a short-term action plan. So it is not a long-term action plan. It is not the answer to the long-term solution for the system. So I agree absolutely with that is not what this is intended to be. One of the problems I think that we've got with a whole system, pressure across the whole system, is that if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll go back into our own particular silos, and we'll get very protective of our own particular organizations or services that we provide. And what we need is more than ever the system to work together as a whole. So in terms of the action plan that we've put together, the action plan is one version of the truth. So there are a proliferation of action plans at the moment into the system. and we're trying to draw these together into one overall improvement plan, short-term improvement plan. Within that plan, we have identified WAST actions, WAST and Health Board actions, and Health Board actions. We are monitoring progress. I am meeting with health boards on a fortnightly basis in terms of progress against the actions in the plan. The plan has not only been approved by EASC, as Jason said, but also, as he said, it's been approved by the NHS Leadership Board. I think the reason why that's important is there's Welsh Government as the third player in this, aren't they? And it's really important that what we do is we get Welsh Government signed up to the actions that have been included, and that as far as mechanisms that they're putting in place, that everybody is following this particular action plan. If the actions aren't working to the extent that we want them to work to, then, and we need to iterate the plan, then how do we iterate the plan? What the system can't cope with at the moment is too many actions. We have to agree collectively what are the right actions. So I'll go directly now to Jason's point around, are the actions, do I think that the actions that WAST are taking are the right actions? Simple answer to that is yes. I think they are the right actions, but they are just those. They are actions, and it's really important that what you continue to do is you continue to deliver those, and that you deliver those at pace and in line with the deadlines that you have committed to. There's only one other thing that we've spoken about, and that is variation. So what we've got at the moment is, all other things being equal, variation in performance, maybe on a day-by-day basis, or on a week-by-week basis. So I think we need to understand why we've got that variation. And if we have got variation outside what we would expect it to look like, either better or worse, that we analyze that, understand it. Are there any lessons that we can learn from that, that we can then put back into the system to make sure we learn that, so we get this improvement trajectory. In terms of the trajectories themselves, we have agreed that by the end of October, that's when we will expect health boards to be delivering the 0 4-hour waits and the 25% reduction. We then review that and then say, well, what's the next trajectory look like, so we can get on this continuous improvement journey. All health boards have signed up to those trajectories. Those are being used by Welsh Government in terms of the IPQD meetings that are held with health boards. And the Minister referred to the action plan in a statement that she made to the Senedd last week. So in terms of all of the key players signed up to this plan and putting our shoulders to the wheel in terms of the delivery of this plan, we're in a much better position from that perspective, as I think we've been in for some time. In terms of the comment that was made about immediate release, I very much agree with the fact that we should get as much out of the principle of agreeing to immediate release that chairs and chief executives have made to the minister as we can. And I think we get the greatest benefit from that in applying immediate release when we're coming up to that 4-hour red line. If we do that, I think the system would gain between 7,000 and 10,000 hours for handover delays back into the system, fewer handover delays. That would still take us to far too high a level. System at the moment is in the 20,000s in terms of handover hours lost. I've gone on record previously to say that I think the system could cope with about 5,000 hours a month before it starts to creak, and we have to make difficult and inappropriate, and sometimes inappropriate decisions. So we've got an awful long way to go in that. If we can reduce that as an initial phase by 7,000 to 10,000 hours, that's a step, absolutely a step in the right direction, even if it's not where we need to be in totality. I'll stop there, Chair, because I'd be happy, probably people will have questions of me in terms of that. And if you wish me to provide any comments on the general discussion that took place from a commissioner point of view, of course, I'm happy to do that, but I'm your guest, so it wouldn't be for me to do that if it's not helpful for you.
Thanks, Stephen. Actually, I think it would be helpful to hear your take on the discussion we've just had, particularly around transformation funding. The point that I was making, I think we should crystallise a view that, you know, obviously we recognise we have to work within the budget, but there are transformational opportunities that we can't realise, which is where I think you've got to your answer to my point, Jason. But accepting this is a public meeting, so you have to be mindful of how far we go in the discussion. But your perspective on that would be helpful.
Okay, so in terms of WAST understanding its position in terms of access to the variety of different national funds that are available, I very much agree with that. I think the more you know about that, the more the system gives you clarity about that, and you starting to influence that, the better. So we shouldn't just be relying on a single source of funding. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. I think we have been successful in getting through the commissioning process quite significant additional funding. One of the things that we put into the EASC IMTP, which was welcomed when we had our letter of support back for the IMTP, I know you've had yours supported as well, was the work that we want to do around value, because I think that's a place that we absolutely have to get into in terms of this value, not just in terms of how we're spending the ambulance pound, but also how we're spending that joined up pound in terms of pre-hospital urgent and emergency care. I think it's a really important place that we get into. I think the other thing is getting transitional funding is not a bad thing. If we can demonstrate that we're using that funding wisely and sensibly, then that transitional funding tends to become recurrent funding if we make the case well enough. Also, in terms of making transitional change, then transitional change takes time. So having transitional funding and using that wisely actually helps, I think, in terms of the long-term strategy that needs to take place. I also very much agree with the comments that Lee was making about balancing risk. Sometimes we might have to take some very difficult short-term decisions to realize long-term ambition. And I think the system needs to understand what that level of risk looks like. So I think we have to be very open and transparent and collaborative in how we're describing that. The system working together in terms of the funding is as important as it is in terms of service delivery. So those would be my general comments in terms of the conversation that you had on that aspect of it. The other thing which I would strongly agree with was the biggest risk is complacency. And I'm hoping that the action plan that we're putting in place will make front and center, will bring front and center what the risks are for patients, the pressures that we're putting staff up, and the quality of service that is being provided, and to keep that at the forefront of our minds. I'd also agree with Paul in terms of the fit to sit protocol. We absolutely have to get that over the line, and we have to push that hard. There may well be some cultural issues associated with that, but we have very few tools in our armory, and this is a really important one to get over the line. I'll stop there, Chair.
That's very helpful. Question or comments on what Stephen said, or I know you want to come in.
Yeah, Stephen, when we met with you on the original paper, we talked about clinical leadership.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear that from a management perspective, you know, at board level and senior manager level, there's a lot of effort being put in.
Yeah.
It's not clear where the clinical leadership for this issue is coming from.
Yeah.
It's not explicit. I know Brendan there, you know, medical directors are having discussions. I know the nurse directors are having discussions. There doesn't seem to be a focused clinical lead on this. And I just want your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I agree with that, Paul. And that's a point that I've made in terms of the actions that I think that clinical leadership, we need to be a lot clearer in terms of that clinical leadership space. I know that CMO and the CNO are having conversations with medical directors and nurse directors around that, and to get clarity about their role, both generically into the system. I think they play their role generically into the system well, but specifically in terms of how do we translate that into actions, and how do we get a few really important things across the line. So that's an area that the plan needs strengthening on, in my view, Paul, and it's something I'm pushing for.
Thank you, Steve.
Brendan.
Yeah, just on the clinical leadership, I think that there have been some changes around the designated responsibilities. So, for example, Andrew Havers, who's one of the senior medical advisors, reached out to me last week. He's now going to take a role specifically looking at the primary and community care aspect of the urgent and emergency care system. So I think we are starting to see some changes there. The one thing I would say is, I've also got a lot of sympathy for what is a very stretched secondary care service at the moment. The medical workforce is really on its knees. Recruitment and retention in some areas is very difficult. I know that nursing has also been a significant problem. I know we've had senior and junior medical staff being asked to do extra shifts, working well beyond contracted hours just to cover the deficiencies in the service. And I know that we're looking at what we can do immediately, but I think that all of the evidence points to the fact that we have a system that results in us taking too many people to the ED, which is overstretched and can't provide the timely opinions by senior clinical staff. And I was looking at some of the literature, and even back in 2012, there was a paper that suggested or confirmed that admissions can be avoided in up to 30% of over 75-year-old frail persons. Now, at the time, it quoted those figures by having better quality decisions by GPs or consultants as early on in the system as possible. We didn't have APPs back in 2012, and it's interesting that those figures are now comparable to what we are producing by putting APPs in the community, making those higher quality clinical decisions early in the system. And I think that, I know we've got to do something short term, but in the medium to long term, I think we absolutely have to focus on, we are taking too many patients unnecessarily into a clinical area where it doesn't suit their clinical needs. And very often they have decisions being made that actually have a detrimental effect on their clinical outcome.
Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to, it picks up a point from earlier as well, doesn't it? Just to really support that, even though we're in a really, really difficult position, acknowledging what you're saying, Lee, around it's very difficult to see what actions we can take that doesn't make things worse in the short term. But I think we've had a lot of conversations about the inverting the triangle and the things that we need to do there. We've got a programme established now that is, internally going to be seeking to take that forward. We've got an engagement piece coming on later in the agenda, which is really key in terms of talking to our public about that. So to me, I think we are setting ourselves up as an organisation to really motor on that, and the financial sustainability programme is really key to helping us with that. And the conversation you had, Jason, about, as well as our own work we can do, seeking assurances or other avenues for some priming, I think is really important. But so I'm completely with you, Martin, that we can't continue to do more of the same. We have to really, as a board now, make sure that we maintain that focus on transformation, with APP being part of it, but CSD being another part of it. Lots of different forms being another. There's lots of aspects actually of that transformation that we need to really push on. And potentially it's exciting, isn't it? Because it's some really good ideas we've got, some really keen people across the organisation, some real skills across the organisation actually. So that's good. I think that we've got that capacity now building to make these changes.
Steve, your hand went up in, I think, response to what Rachel was saying.
Just to violently agree with that conversation, really. and is absolutely what we should be doing. And I think from a commissioning perspective, 5-step pathway is what we have all signed up to. The shift left is what we've all signed up to, and how that links into the 6 goals for urgent emergency care is very easy to see. So the challenge for us, I think, is to make sure that we're using those mechanisms to make that happen. And I agree with the conversation, which is we shouldn't just focus on short-term actions. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we do that, but they are important as well. They've got an important part to play, particularly when we have the level of risk that the system is running at the moment. So it's a very fine balancing act that we're trying to collectively walk here. But I agree absolutely in terms of that. Also, to the chief executive of health boards, by the way, they violently agreed with that. Agree with that when you have conversations at EASC around that. What they are saying though is that it's probably best if we have what's the transformation look like on a health board by health board basis, and then how do WAST help support and empower and enable that to happen. So that's the challenge, which is why I think that conversation around fitting the system and understanding the rules and engaging properly in that, I think, is a really important one. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, helpful. I think we've probably reached the end of the discussion. We've punched ourselves out on an important subject. Do you feel comfortable going to the recommendations at this point?
Yeah.
I'm going to bring that, let that run, because frankly, that was an unsatisfactory conversation. We needed to cover all angles. So I think I'm assuming that the recommendations firstly that we note the contents of the paper and the actions taken today and underway. We're all happy to do that. They've been, Jason extensively covered those in his introduction. Discuss and agree whether the totality of actions taken underway are necessarily sufficient in all circumstances. Provide suitable assurance to the board that A, will take them in turn. WAST has taken all reasonable steps in saying that it can ameliorate the risk of avoidable harm to our patients and our people. I think the end proviso there, that's working within existing resources, isn't it? In fact.
And it's a short-term action plan. So we agreed.
I would say within, given the constraints we have to work in, we are taking all reasonable steps. That fair? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think so. I mean, I think this is always hard. We will always challenge ourselves. Is there more we could do? But we've heard Stephen over an external lens also say the actions we're taking are the right ones. I do think they are, and we are constantly looking for other ways to ameliorate the risk that exists. But they feel reasonable.
I think one of the distinctions is we are trying to deal with the current harm, and our transformation is about preventing.
Yeah, well, that's
two different aspects, aren't they?
B, the escalation. I won't read all those words out. Sufficient escalation has taken place.
I think we've been everywhere to everyone.
So I can't think of anyone who's not told, including, of course, the public today. It's pretty much
one thing that came up was something Andy said earlier, and I'm wondering if this is quite a powerful point, isn't it? If we can correlate the impact of alternatives to admission, I'm wondering if there's enough evidence in the system, or whether we're pushing that evidence into, hard enough to convince people that this is something worth investing in because it saves them.
Well, I wondered whether that, what I said, fitted into that last recommendation, which is about, we're all delighted on the fact that transformation is the
way forward.
But constraints within the current regime that mean we can do so much and we're satisfied as we are. That transformation is the big ticket item that, as everyone said, Brendan and Andy particularly, the transformation will deflect away from ED, reduce conveyance. I think there's something in relation to this discussion about
it's changing the sort of theoretical side of it to practical, to actual, use evidence, use proof that this works, and this stops people being rather than, it's just maybe pushing that a bit.
Well, it's linked to what you said, Jason, about that we were going in very straight terms back with not able to access funding sources that are healthcare, for example, are. Stephen actually endorsed that comment. There's something about we as a board that we wish to press the pedal hard on transformation and sources of funding for those transformation actions, including such items as the APP bid. On the basis we think that the best bang for the buck, so ultimately serve to transform the situation.
Yeah, so I mean, on that point, Martin, I've started to explore with the team. It needs a little bit more discussion about how we generate a conversation with government, particularly government colleagues, particularly about this transformation piece and how we garner support, more support to practically enable transformation. So I think more on that in the next couple of weeks. Because we just need to plan how we run that conversation, and crucially, what is good for life for us.
So you're happy with frame recommendation around that? We're putting number 8 to say that that's the territory we want to work on. We need to be very high level because the detail of the rest of the
Well, I wonder if we leave the recommendation as it is, perhaps Jeremy suggested an alternative to that. Leave the recommendation as it is the board satisfied with the resolution we escalated the short-term concerns that we had, and I take an action away with the team to then work through with the executive team to then work through how we generate and press forward with that transformation conversation, which essentially is a further action. Yeah, so I take that away as an action and bring that back to the board in the next couple of weeks.
We're acknowledging where we are at this point in time, because we've been on a bit of a journey in closed session, the 3 committees that I mentioned to get to this. So that's where you're going next, and the 3 committees will be scrutinising next steps in detail. So
with that,
yeah,
because we will. I think we will find ourselves saying up the line, so to speak, that within the transformation things that we cannot do currently because of constraints of budget. But we think that there is a line of inquiry about alternative funding sources and with creative cooperation from partners and Welsh government. We might be able to fulfil some of those possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, we have placed in the system the evidence of the APP program and the evidence of high non-compliance rate, etc. We've done all that before, but we will do that again, and we will do that in a different way to try to.
I guess Steve release will be quite crucial in those discussions, won't they?
I think some more general point.
And what should pick this, which we might want. Okay, I think we'll capture that discussion in the notes, and the action that Jason will follow up is around that transformation piece and funding. If you're happy with that, okay. That brings an end to item 8. We're way behind time, so let's take 10 minutes and see how we group that time. Well, it means a late lunch. It is going to have to be strictly, we'll say 11:42.
Thanks,
Stephen.
Thank you.
I think we could have the windows open.
I'll give you your hands, Trish, with the risk management and corporate risk management. As you can tell, the 1 o'clock finishes under some pressure. So I'd like to say we'll consider everything into that space, but I don't think that's going to be possible. So we need to allow for a short lunch break, unfortunately, because we are committed to the 2 o'clock. So it may be that we're up to 1:30, but we'll do our best to come in within that. Okay, Rick, Trish, over to you, not Rachel. Apologies.
Thanks, Chair. So the board and the board committees have seen the progression of the rearticulation of the principal risks on the risk register over the last quarter. And all the committees have discussed the risk within their remit during that period, and also the rationale for any changes in scores. You'll recall that through Q4 and into Q1 of this year, we developed a transitional VAF that provides a much fuller picture of those principal risks, and that's at Annex 4. So you'll see there that we've got the controls and the related assurances mapped to each other, so you can have a read across to those. And in some instances, you'll also see where the first, second and third lines of defence are drawn out as well. You'll see the gaps in controls and assurances are also included in that paper for each risk, together with the actions that are planned and in train to address those gaps and to mitigate the risks. So this BAF was reviewed by the Audit Committee in their last meeting. And you'll see the Audit Committee highlight report at 14.1 calls for elevated levels of scrutiny and accountability of those high-rated risks and actions by the board. And it's hoped that this revised transitional BAF format will give the board much more information to do that. So you've got much more information about what's in train, what the controls are, how you can be assured against those controls. That will mature more as the risk program develops. But I think in a short period of time, we've been given much more information in this new format for the board to scrutinise and hold to account. The paper also at Annex 3 sets out the risk reporting timetable, which was agreed at the Audit Committee. And whilst this allows for a line of sight of those governance routes for the BAF, and it assists with planning for that, it does mean that for this first transitional BAF, there's a bit of a lag from the time it went through that last gate at executive management team. But I think what you'll see is that corrects itself. So by the next cycle, the board should receive a much more updated board assurance framework. But as we know, with these very large risks, there isn't a huge amount of movement in the scores between the quarters, but they are reviewed monthly in accordance with the review timetable. So because of the actions, because of that lag, the actions that form part of the discussion that we just had in agenda item 8 are not included in risks 223 and 224. So 223 being the inability to reach patients in the community causing harm, and 224 being those handover delays impacting access to definitive care. They remain at 25. We've just been through all of the actions that will make their way into this board assurance framework. And some of those actions will also now become controls and address some of those gaps. So by the next time you see this BAF, you'll see those playing through. Same with the board committees. There are 3 other risks that are rated high at 20, one being sickness risk, the health and safety, and the reputational risks are rated at 20. They're all also reviewed monthly in accordance with the timetable. Lastly, Chair, there was an internal audit on risk management in Q4, which resulted in a reasonable assurance rating, and that was reviewed at the Audit Committee as well. So I'll stop there, Chair.
Thank you. Martin, you might want to say something.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to cover a point in 14.1 now rather than later, which is relevant to what's just been said. This is quite a detailed report, but it really pulls together a lot of things that are being dealt with elsewhere. So this is it's quite a technical document actually, and it's a 38-page document. We're not going to scrutinise that here. So what came up at the Audit Committee, and it was something we agreed to bring here for open discussion really, was with the very high rated risks, 2020s maybe, certainly 25s, which is the highest risk, and maybe 20, which will probably be 5, 3
at the moment.
and 20s and 20.
5 in total with the 25s and the 20s.
Whilst they're dealt with by the executives and other committees, the issue is, does the board need more detail on those risks and how we're dealing with them? Now, if you look at today's agenda, we actually dealt with them in a detailed report that Jason brought, but that's more, not by accident, that is the way we're putting it. It's not as a matter of course. So if we said, right, as a matter of course, anything with a rating of 25 or 20 will come here as a report, not as this is being dealt with somewhere else. Because I think it's such a big, high priority. This board should have the opportunity to discuss it, not receive a report from a committee that says this is okay. Now, others around the table might have a different view, but this was so the recommendation from the Audit Committee is that you talk about this, or we talk about it, rather than give you a proposition that says it should come here. You know my view, because I probably just expressed it.
Joker, who's not here.
Joker supported this. I can't remember who else was up to the committee.
I was there.
Oh, Paul was not. Paul would agree with that. That point being that, you know, do you want a full report on the high risk areas to come to this group, rather than at the moment, it's, if you look at the way it's done, just as put, I think it's owner and then assurance framework. You know, the assurance bit is going to committees rather than the full board. That's what's been happening now. My suggestion is that if it's 25, it should come in rather than
just under 2 risks.
So, I mean, I'm not saying what we're doing is wrong. I'm just saying there is a different way of doing it, and maybe the full board should be more engaged in the very, very high risks that the board is dealing with.
Hughes. I was just going to say that I understand, Martin, what you're saying. I'm just wondering, would there be any members of the board that would not have seen this in its journey through the committees? So would not be very familiar with it.
Yeah, audit committee,
and
by and large,
and their
chairman,
and therefore, is it in the way we escalated the, you know, the paper that Jason just presented and the risks and everything that is it that kind of exceptional route? Because I think it's will be familiar with most of this.
Yeah, I think it's about engagement. You know, if it's that important, do we want a subcommittee dealing with all the full board?
They're committees of the board, they're not subcommittees.
No, well, they aren't. No, they're not, because they report to the board as committees
of the board.
Yeah. Now, like I said, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying there's a different approach. I say this, I'll give you an example. You know, some of the things we talked today, I was really happy. I understand what we're doing. I can go away from this meeting and articulate all the stuff that Jason and we all talked about earlier. When it comes to other issues, sickness, as an example, you've heard me moan about. I moan because I don't understand it enough and I don't feel comfortable that I know enough. And you know, here's me speaking as somebody who thinks we do too much. I actually think here's an issue where perhaps we do too little, only because it's an escalated high risk issue. And all I'm suggesting is that, you know, the chairman doesn't see it unless it comes here and doesn't engage. I mean, yes, he engages informally is the wrong word, but outside of the formal frameworks we've got. I'm just wondering, you know, if everybody's happy, then, you know, so yeah.
I think it's a valid point, but it's something that actually I think Kerry and I talked about, where sometimes one of the non-execs will know more about an issue than the other because they don't have to go on committee. So I think for the high risks, and it links to the performance. We inadvertently talked about all of them, actually. You know, through the quality and safety report and through the performance report, actually, we talk about the issue. That's what we don't do, is explicitly link the risk to the discussion. You see what I mean? We cover it. And as a paper, well, the chair, we had this discussion where the chair of the board doesn't know as much as some of the committee chairs because it's never got to, you know, it's a brief that comes to the board rather than a report. So I think it is valid, particularly on those risks, but I would like to link it to what we currently do rather than another report. Because actually we do talk about all those risks in each of the reports, but we don't highlight that this report is actually tackling this major risk. And perhaps that's where we need to be a bit more explicit.
There is a discipline about the board saying that's some of the top 5, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think so.
They are so of such magnitude. We've just done that in more detail than I think reasonably good enough for those 2 risks today, haven't we? So something in between.
Link it to the current reporting mechanisms we've got.
I'll start with Lee, Rachel, Trish, you coming first, staging post, sorry, Gary.
I was just going to agree with what Paul was saying as well, in as much as when we do set agendas, we have an eye on what those big risks are and make sure that the reports draw from that and go to those risks. There is some work to do to make sure that that golden thread goes all the way through. And I think like we did today, there's a standalone report because those two are 25. So the board assurance framework should drive the agenda as to what's on there and what the priority is. And we are having those conversations as we are setting agenda. That is happening. But I think also, you know, a point not to be lost here is that the new timetable will have this back going through the audit committee as that first port of call post executive management team. So we've rejigged the governance of that because audit committee does look after risks, so they will be getting it through that route. And I think that we probably just need to settle into that routine as well. But and this report will come. This risk report will come to each board meeting as well, and we should have much more information. Now, the trick is going to be us drawing it through, so you don't have to read those 38 pages, you know, with a fine-tooth comb necessarily, but having that exec summary perhaps a little bit more punchy as well. So I think it's a few things that we can do around it.
Kerry, Stell.
Thanks, Chair. So I think it's healthy for us to wait a little bit of time to, you know, to see how that cycle and the way in which we operate answers some of those questions. But for me, the point around sickness that we spoke about. So how I as a member of this board seek assurance on sickness if I'm not on people and culture committee. So I can delve into the papers. I think that's harder. So for me, I'm looking at then the report from the committee. And I guess for me, they feature quite low down on our agenda. We don't often talk about them. I can make the decision to ask questions about it. So I think it's also about us seeking that individual responsibility as independent members to seek assurance. So although, and I think obviously the new chair might have a view on this, Martin, your perspective on we should have oversight of those top 5 risks here feels really healthy. So then I'm thinking, you know, is it something that could also, is going to feature in Jason's report? So probably for me, I'm open to us ensuring that those top 5 risks are featured here. I'm not sure that another report at this moment in time is going to help us. It's like how we ensure we do have those discussions.
No, I'll keep my powder dry. I'll keep my powder dry.
So the principle of the board scrutinising the top 5 systematically rather than random, I think it's a sound one. How the reporting works might be another thing. Still, back to you, Martin.
Thanks, Chair. So at the risk of preempting the later conversation around the engagement framework, colleagues who've been around a long time will remember that the original iteration of the engagement framework was to actually tackle the issue of reputation, specifically because reputation is a very difficult thing to measure, isn't it? Because a lot of it is temperature checking, and a lot of it is around both our own performance, but also how we're perceived in the wider community and with stakeholders. It's not necessarily something about, you know, yes, I can read, you know, how many negative stories in the media and positive, etc. But actually, that's a futile measure of reputation, because it's a bean counting measure. What it doesn't measure is impact. So you can have one negative story in a 6-month period that will blow your reputation out of the water, regardless of the 20 that you've done that are positive. But you will note, those of you who've read the engagement framework paper, is I am proposing that the engagement framework moving forward returns to reporting to the board. Originally, it reported to the board. Subsequently, it reported to people and culture when we've got a handle on things and things are running more smoothly. I am now proposing, given the extent of what we need to do in terms of managing those engagement interfaces during a really turbulent process of change for us, that we report it here at the board. Now we can extend that out, we can use it as a proxy for reputation. But I can give some thought to that in the hands of the board, obviously. But just to put that out, that in that paper it does say that moving forward, I would want that engagement framework to come back in its reporting to the board.
Okay, we'll move on to that soon. Lee.
I mean, I think Paul probably touched on where I was going to go, Chair. The natural part for me would be to avoid any sense or form of duplication, just because of the workload that requires. And today, the risk that I own on 223, we very clearly have extensively discussed. So I think I agree around, I mean, regularly, I think we have quality items, we have performance, 2, 2, 3, therefore, and then I think yours as well, following that, inevitably get covered. It might be more of a matter of those that aren't covered, that there might be some discussion around those, just to avoid the sense of duplication. I mean, the only other part, of course, as well, is there are assigned committees. And so if there are, my feedback would be if there are members here who don't feel as though they're aware of what's taking place at the committees, then perhaps that needs more focus in the reporting that's coming through. Because otherwise we are pulling everybody into every committee's business.
My thought was it's quite a lot of paperwork on this. Do we have enough discussion about mitigating action as a board, seeing improvement and reduction of risk? We probably don't be quite static. Today we weren't on that road, what we were in the zone of how can we really change these two risks. That's not the norm, so it's probably much to do about the spirit of the discussion, about the detail. Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna, my personal view is, I think it's sensible that the board is cited properly on the top risks, and that we do. And I agree with you that we've tried to avoid duplication. I was just thinking, Paul, about the comment you made about putting, so some of it doesn't fit in with performance report because reputation wouldn't be part of that. The sickness would be, and that's always there. And so it could be that element. We could have a supplementary appendix or something that actually pulls out. No, a lot of them are, not all of them are. A reputation is one that isn't. But I agree. I think I'm sure we can find a way of bringing those a bit more detail because I agree with the chair. That's sensible that you should be cited. I know you are anyway.
Yeah, it's not a question of detail. It's whether we as a board collectively look at the top 5 worries are properly. Yeah. So how can we make a difference to them? That's what we're without seeing the CEO, doing the CEO's job. So it may be in the time given to the item, pointers to say, look, you've got to look at this. Tell me about the reputation of this, what we're doing to improve it. It's got to be quite a direct discussion, isn't it?
I agree. I think that there is a place for that executive summary to draw from around the rest of the agenda. And then perhaps where there isn't an agenda, because 201 for reputation, we've got a paper on engagement framework. We're looking at that. The board assurance framework does give you more meat on the bones as to what is actually happening for these individual risks. So if there isn't, and I wouldn't want to duplicate paper, but that might be drawn out as a discussion of, are we doing everything? Same discussion we had at the previous agenda item. Do we think that we've covered all the gaps? Do we think that all the actions are going to mitigate it? Are they going to reduce the score by the time of the last action? So I think there's a number of ways we can do it. It's just having the intention of having more focus on those 20s and 25s here and how we draw that through. And similarly in the committees, just drawing that through.
It's the actual mitigation. It's not a case of just watching the scorecard and saying, oh yeah, that risk hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So I think we're arriving at, Martin, is in the spirit of that discussion, just going through the committee in a different way from that should add strength to that.
Let me just respond to a couple of things that have been said, because I think it was really quite an interesting discussion we just had and listening to different views. Audit committee was trying to do a number of things. So don't forget, I had an audit cap on as well as a board member hat on. And I have to admit, they cross over my head a couple of times when I talk about it. But let's put my audit chair hat on. The one thing was that I was concerned that some of the risks were coming to audit committee, and audit committee was owning them. And I said, nope, it is not a responsibility. Audit committee's role through the back was to make sure there was a governance framework that looked at them and managed them. When we did that, we were fairly happy that most things were in the right place, or had a home, if you like, in terms of scrutiny and assurance. When it came to the top risks, though, we said, right, should the board be the place that looks at the top risks, or should it be a delegated responsibility to its committees? Now, there will be, no doubt, some duplication as a consequence of what I'm saying, because I think the answer is both, which is what we're saying, maybe. That's what I'm hearing around the room. But you have a specialist group that looks at specialist areas, whether it's people. But the board needs to have more understanding and better understanding and probably input, which is your point, and certainly mine, more input into those discussions because of their rating. We've rated them 25. Board, that's my view. It starts at the board, and then it says, right, how are we going to deal with this? Yeah, we might have, the most we'll give it, like today, is an hour. An hour every 2 months is not a lot to deal with the top 25. The top risks.
So it's something we hear from the committees, the specialist committees, you get more on their take on this. And then you as a board would be probing to establish, well, if we done all the mitigating.
And answering Kerry's point of actually understanding the problem and the responses that are being made by the organisation to mitigate. And so this, that's an important, we are the board, we need to understand what's happening.
Action focused risk discussion, which drives the.
And I think, it might be duplication, but when it's a score of 25, so what? Is that important? We should be dealing with it on that basis.
Yeah, I'd be happy to leave that with you and Trish to work through as a process without coming up with another layer of reporting. I think the way of doing this, I think you're saying, Trish, that satisfies that need. Report being written in such a way it actually makes us look at things. This is action oriented. The audit committee overseeing the process as well, that strengthens it. So I think we need to capture that in minutes, I think. You happy with that discussion? Pretty well, actually.
One last comment, it's an important one. The role and responsibility of executives here is paramount. The non-executives are here to help the execs. So the committees need to be assurance-based committees, not action-based committees, essentially. Yes, you will draw, I think the committees will draw advice and views and opinions from people like me and others and discard them or otherwise. But the action actually is done with the chief executive and his executive team. And that's an important point to be made here. Don't push it up to your committee's call and say, here's a problem, what do we do about it? Here's the problem, here's our solution, what do you think about it? And I think that's an important distinction.
I think the work that Trish has been doing and the discussions we've had about the communities and the business cycle does that now.
Yes, absolutely.
It's more about assurance, so we don't see everything. We get assurance that action has been taken over, whether that's managers' attendance, etc.
I think this part is a significant step forward. There's a lot of work gone into it, and it is, it'll always be work in progress because that's what it is. But it is really good in my view as an assurance document for the board.
So it's next stage on, isn't it? More describing. Happy with that discussion? Trish, we didn't quite stick to the script, did we?
No,
it's actually a very useful discussion.
It's incredibly helpful because it does actually, it brings risk alive, doesn't it? And there's a number of different ways we can attack that. So I think it's very helpful.
We have to go to the recommendations, won't we? We missed anything. So we received the revised framework from Trish on its emergent, it's a good document. No, the actions which mitigating risks 223 and 224, which are the avoidable harm payment already covered, so but a real value there. Note the adoption of the new risk matrix, nationally agreed, and the group risk reporting timetable. Are we happy with all those things? Yeah. Okay. And the minutes to capture that discussion, I think, would be helpful. Good. Move on. As you mentioned, the integrated quality and performance report. You know what I'm going to say, we've probably covered some aspects of this already.
No, let's do this all in all the detail. No, yes, I agree.
You provide that for me to
I know.
with torches.
No, I agree. So, just in terms of the main report, then, as you say, Chair, we spent a lot of time on things which are effectively performance around the EMS side. So I will just bring out perhaps a couple of issues around 111, as we haven't talked about that today. And you'll note that whilst call handling times have improved, actually still the ring back times from a clinical perspective, certainly for the lower priority cases that should be run back in 2 and 4 hours, we're not hitting those targets at all. In fact, that's deteriorating. And that is having an effect. We know we were talking about it in execs a couple of weeks ago. We've seen surveys, recent surveys from one-on-one users who are finding that a very difficult experience. We've got a lot of vacancies within the clinical field in one-on-one, so I suppose it's, it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but it's a good assurance that as an exec team we have focused on that recently. Execs, we have got an action plan that's emerging. We're sharing that with our commissioners tomorrow in our Gateway to Care programme board. So we are focused, on really developing ideas and ways of improving the recruitment and retention of our clinicians there in order to reach the level that we're commissioned for. So that's just picking that up. I think, as you say, we've picked up an awful lot on the EMS side, so I don't think there's anything particularly we need to pick out there. Ambulance care, I think, we continue to see relatively good performance in that area of our organisation, which is good. And it was really pleasing that we had a focus on the session lease recently on that, because kind of raised the focus and priority of that important service. So probably there isn't much else that I would want to pick out, except that obviously we said earlier, didn't we, that we would potentially cover the sickness bit, but I don't know whether the conversation we've just had in terms of acknowledging that sickness as one of our very highest risks warrants some further discussion. Now, we haven't got the papers or things to support that type of conversation today, but in the pack is obviously some sense of the improving attendance work programme that we've got. So some of the areas of action that we're taking there, and Jason alluded to the improvements that we saw through May and June in terms of overall sickness absence and hitting the trajectory that we'd set ourselves in those 2 months. So I don't know, I'll just pause on that bit, because Martin, you wanted to return to sickness.
I think given the conversation we've just had, I think we should test the system. We haven't got as much time to talk about it. I think I'm happy to see what you do next, in terms of the way you inform us, given the conversation we just had. I mean, I'll give you some of my concerns. I don't want answers, but some of them are about sustainability. Is what we're doing sustainable? If we're bringing sickness levels down, what have we done to do that? I'd like to know what actions we've taken. How do we compare with others? Those are the sorts of things that strike me as important to the board to understand. It is great that this come down, and it is. But is it long term? Is it sustainable? What are the issues, and how do we compare? So it's things like that. But I don't want the answers now. But those are the sorts of things I think, as a board member, I'd be interested in understanding going forward, rather than just the data.
You can use development time if needs be, Martin, to.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mind how it's done, but unless it falls into the top 5 or whatever number we talked about earlier, in which case, arguably there should be a specific report coming that covers these issues.
Okay, good. On that point.
Yeah, just to say that we are undergoing a field with an audit and a management attendance and what we're doing, so I think that would be last information.
What the time is having an update. It is top of the list every time we minister, isn't it? Right, it's one of those influences for us.
Yeah, just a small point in respect of when we look at sickness absence, absolutely acknowledging, as you said earlier, all the work we've done in order to support our staff. Just pointing out the majority of the measures that we put in are there to support after the event. It's talking about stretching, and it'd be, nice for us to look at what we can do within the working environment prior to somebody actually ending up being sickness absence. So it's just
That's the least point earlier about.
It is.
Encouraging people to come forward, isn't it?
And also, about that's it, it's just not about the information, but also about actually acting on that prior to the event, so we've got lots afterwards, but actually can we stop them in the first place?
Yeah. Just to comment on sickness, which was interesting, Martin, you flagged as a potential discussion, is there anything I've written down against the performance report with our ambition to get a distraction rate of 30%? How effective we do that with all the parameters we set, given there's an innate level of sickness will always be there. So the way it makes the point and they're reliable, we need to better understand the sickness piece. So it's coming to a session.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just to answer that particular question, was the 30% came from the demand capacity.
Yeah, to understand its source.
And it requires us to get to 6% sickness, which we were pre-pandemic, and which our trajectory over the course of the 3 years of the IMTP commits us to doing. So not immediate, so we recognise those questions, but we have suggested that over a 3 year period, we ought to be able to reduce that back to where we were pre-pandemic. But I think I'm just looking now at the slide which talks about sickness in particular. I know a lot more than was on that slide, but I get the point that if you haven't been people in culture, you wouldn't get an awful lot from that in terms of those issues that you've raised. So I think that's a reasonable point. So that was all I was going to pull out on the performance, the metrics bit that I just really need to touch on as well, if that's all right. So can I move on to that?
Before you do, so right, Jason, breathed in there.
One for the last 2 hours. No, we'll do a deep dive into sickness or attendance management part, probably at the next development seminar.
Okay, so if I could just move then, if there are no other, let's say, all of that performance report we've covered in some detail and constant time. So,
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Can I do our usual up to speed position? Is that okay, Chair?
Best to, so I've encouraged you to.
Yeah. So
sorry, Rachel.
So just to give a flavour then as to where we're at, I don't have stories of improvement, unfortunately, since the last board. Our red performance so far this month is, however, up on the previous month, but it still remains a really long way from where we would want it to be. And we certainly do see, I think, the challenges present in terms of utilisation and ambulance utilisation, which is running far, far too high. The consequence of the system pressures is showing through in an extended travel time to red incidents. And what that means is that the resources are not in the right place at the right time in order to provide that degree of community cover so that they can provide, 8 minutes is very quick. So resource needs to be free and in the right place. And without the availability to move resource away from hospital sites into community locations, that's going to remain a real challenge for us. So that is where we are seeing the stress in terms of travel time. In terms of the amber position, we've had a little bit of improvement actually as we came into the back end of the month, but the start of the month was so stressed, and there were of course COVID impacts with the wave that we're now emerging from. There has been patient flow consequences of the most recent wave. Amber, unfortunately, is looking like it's a parallel to our longest month, unfortunately, for patient waits. The handover lost times are continuing in the same fashion that we've seen in more recent months. We're currently at about 21,000 hours lost. I'm anticipating 23, 24, probably by the end of the month. So the stress that presents will remain with us. And the month to date, average patient handover time, sadly, is over 2 hours. So that's not, or we aren't getting signs or signals that the measures so far are biting. So that's remained still very high. It's been, I think, quite helpful for us to begin to enhance our understanding of some of our people impacts. And this is, Jason mentioned this, with overruns and meal breaks. And so depending on the geography in Wales at the moment, between 26 and 43% of shifts are running late and extending. And we know that 25% of those are for more than an hour. And almost 40% of first meal breaks are also late. So there are quite serious people consequences of the current setting. I think what I want to do is just to offer something on the prognosis for now the period that we're going to come into. You know, summer's been interesting for us so far because of course we've had the heat wave episode. Now demand over the heat wave episode was contained in comparison to previous heat periods, so that's been favourable, and I think we wait now to see what the summer holds in terms of activity with the staycation. So we'll see what fares. But of course, and again, Jason alluded to this earlier on. If we cast our mind back to that chart that was in the earlier report, correlating lost hours to amber, you can see that there was a period of improvement, which when the military was with us and the median times came down, and that's effective. And that was 100 to 250 in terms of additional people. But of course, the wait times were still very long, and still far too long. And so whilst the 100 FTE are going to be very welcome, that's not going to be sufficient to cover 24,000 hour lost capacity with the handover delays. And again, we've been through the mitigations that we are developing and wish to deploy over summer. The reality is, of course, that the combination is still not going to be sufficient to cover 24,000 hour lost capacity. So the reduction of those, and we heard the part that our partners are playing to do that, are going to be absolutely vital in order to improve that performance prognosis. So it's you know, regrettable that I would need to share with people that I'm anticipating over at least the next few months more of the same.
A salutary reminder to keep looking at the key risks and how we mitigate the transformation piece that we talked about earlier.
Can I also say a thank you because it's been a really busy period. So over the last period, we've had to plan to respond to the Platinum Jubilee. We planned around the Royal Welsh Show. We had to stand up measures in response to the fuel protests. And of course, we've had a wave of COVID and the extreme heat. So there has been an awful lot outside of the regular performance reporting that the organisation has had to respond to. So I'd like to thank our emergency planning team who have been literally going from one event to the next over the last period. And of course, the organisation and our staff who have continued to respond with those challenges around them. We should just acknowledge those.
Thank you for that, Lee.
Thank you.
Get back to metrics, Rachel.
Thank you. So, yeah, so there's a slide deck here which we went through at Performance Committee and also gone through at execs. So I'm not going to labour it hugely because I'm hoping that it will be relatively straightforward. But we committed to reviewing the metrics that we use in this board level report every year at least. In order that we are confident that they the right metrics to enable us as a board to see that we're making progress on our strategic ambitions and our NTP plans. So we've done that. We've looked at, for example, things that are measures that the commissioners have asked us to look at. We've looked at the NHS delivery performance framework, which has a series of measures in it that we need to report on to Welsh Government. We've considered our own INTP, and as a result, there are some changes which we are proposing, and you can see in the slide deck. So the first slide is the current metrics that we use, and then each subsequent slide looks at each quadrant, and where something is in red, we're suggesting we take it out. Where something's in green, we're suggesting we add it in. So for quality, safety and patient experience set of metrics, we will be adding in something around stroke, particularly in terms of call to door times. That's the commissioning intention that we bring that forward, and we take out as a result the stroke bundle compliance. Metrics that we're taking out at this level doesn't mean we're not looking at them. They will be still looked at in Quest or the appropriate committee, and certainly as we do execs as well. So it wouldn't be that. And then we're adding in as well that metric around immediate release, and two others. One which is around bringing forward, I think, that sense of harm where we are not able to send an ambulance, or where patients are cancelling ambulances. So we don't know the harm actually in any of those patients. But we felt strongly, I think, that the board ought to be citing the numbers of patients that is, that's occurring for, as an indication of a possible and likely harm coming to that group of patients. And then we haven't got indicators on patient experience and outcomes, but we've committed to trying to develop something at a board level that gives us an idea of a patient view. Then in terms of our people, we've streamlined that a little bit. The key thing here is that we're producing the number of hours against our commission levels. So at this level, you don't need to know how many FTEs we've got in or abstractions, as they all contribute to whether or not we're producing the hours. And then we've added in the not just organisational sickness, but actually looking particularly operational in the operations directorate, because that's where we've got this IMTP trajectory, which we're going to be kind of monitored on at the ministerial level. And in terms of well-being, we thought another indicator that actually is useful at this level is turnover rate. That's like that concept of, if there's higher levels of turnover, that's an indicator of a workforce that potentially isn't as happy. And again, we haven't decided on it yet, but we want to add in an indicator around inclusion and engagement with our staff. So that will be something, and there's lots to do. It's picking one that kind of gives the board that overall sense. In terms of value, we haven't got many in this area. We're adding in here data that we need to report on nationally in terms of emissions, and also something around the value, particularly in terms of numbers of jobs per shift. So because the utilisation metric that we are currently trying to work towards tells you how many hours a member of staff is working with a patient. But of course, if they're only looking after one patient in the back of an ambulance for the whole of their shift, that's not really, from a value perspective, it's another angle on the value of the use of resources. So that suggested that's in. And then on the last quadrant, which is around system contribution, we're going to, rather than conveyance rates, which depending on what the denominator is, and depending on, do you take into account the fact that lots of patients are voting with their feet and taking themselves into hospital rather than us, it's not a particularly useful indicator on its own. What's more interesting is our see and treat rate, which then starts to move into the kind of, how are we building the figures in the triangle space, particularly around the APPs. And then we do have this idea of pathways. This is a national measure and a ministerial measure. Percentage of the conveyances that we take to hospital, which of them are going to somewhere else other than the ED. So this is where the SDEC type of pathways come in. So we need to have an eye on that. It's a ministerial priority. And then we added in here as well something around the 4-hour wait, because we just talked about that. It's not just the total number of hours. We know there's a commitment to seeing no 4-hour waits. And we added something back in, and I know we've been in and out on this type of one. There's something on our, if we're thinking about our strategic ambition to do more digitally, we need to have something on that front end piece. So we picked, it's not an idea, completely ideal, but let's, can we see a growth in the number of people accessing and completing symptom checkers on our website? We do need to develop further indicators that more, that better articulate show how we're improving that part. So as I say, that those have been agreed with EMT, went through FP, and I did outside the meeting, then also talked to you, Paul, as the chair of people and culture, just to check that you were comfortable with that. So I'd like to approve it if possible.
Oh yes, that is the last recommendation. What we do.
Yeah, just an observation really. I think I really welcome the focus on patient outcomes. I think stroke targets in particular having oversight of that, and I think it's very much in line with the policy strategy, the intent and the ambition around this, the accurate and stroke.
Thank you. Martin.
I'm just gonna, on the value one, we haven't got a lot. We've got nothing about capital, utilization of capital or return on investment on capital. I just wonder, is there something that we could use? Because we are investing a lot in capital.
Okay.
Just something to think
Maybe
about.
not for this road now, but that's
No,
possibly
no,
doing
something to
something
think
to
about,
develop.
because it's the one element of
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
value so we won't really look at. So that's what we,
Yeah.
Okay, that way.
That's noted. Martin.
Yeah, mine was a question really about transformational agenda really is it possible to establish how many of the people we bring in could have been prevented from being brought in if we had an alternative like advanced practitioner in place, so that we can actually say in reality, you know, here's the patients we could have prevented from coming in if these services were in place. I don't know if the data is there to do that.
Well, in fact, we do. I mean, it might be something again we bring forward as another topic of discussion at some point before, but we have had some modelling done from ORH as a follow-up to the original demand and capacity review, and we asked them to model, you know, what if we had 50, 100, 150, 200 more APPs, what would that do to the system? And it's very significant. So we've got, you know, reductions in conveyance. You could see the numbers. You could see the impact that has then on hospital handover delays because you're not taking.
I assume that was a theoretical exercise.
It is a theoretical. So that's what we've done looking forward, saying what could happen if we have these. So applying that to here and now, I suppose is what we're saying.
Yeah.
There would be no difficulty in doing that because we do know exactly the difference that no PP makes.
I'm wondering whether we should do it on the basis that it would be strengthening, coming back to strengthening the arguments for transformation. I don't know. It's just, anyway, something people should think about as opposed to.
But through the EPCR, perhaps we've got, you know, better than
that. Yeah, part of inverting the triangle stuff. That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And we do have we've got massive evidence there. We have a massive evidence around the end of pathway. Yeah. So no,
Sorry, keep going. You're on.
And so we do have a lot of that evidence, but it is, you know, in its discrete box. We don't have quite stuff like this, is what you were saying.
Yeah.
But we do have some very powerful evidence in those two areas alone. Sorry, Jason.
No, I mean, it's helpful to me. That starts to in bringing together the action I talked about, you know, or the earlier discussion, you know, and having the conversation with government, particularly about, you know, innovation and transformation and access to that. One of the things we want to do is demonstrate what we are currently doing in terms of reporting. So if we did have a national full scheme, if we haven't extended it, if we haven't got the 80% we've got now, if we weren't doing 15% year on tree, this is the number of people we've taken in. You know, so then that's the kind of evidence of the transformation from the start. And then the second bit of that conversation, I think, is okay. So then if we roll that forward, you know, what could we be avoiding? What else could we be avoiding in today's world if we had access to the support for transformation? And I think there's a ratio that's been worked out, isn't there, of compliance for this type of tools and that type of tools. We can then easily run into activity.
So again, comes down to soundbite.
This is the value we can offer.
Yeah, that's helpful. So we'll withdraw that, Martin, for follow up on that. Jason, we're moving to. We're happy to go to the recommendations. What do we reverse or to do the improving of metrics first? I think we'll improve those metrics. They've been through the.
Yeah, thank you.
Been through the mill. Okay, and there's a scope to come back to the capital as a follow-up area. And then we're asked to consider the report. It's sufficient insurance, and further insurance is required as you need of action. I covered most of that here in the discussion, frankly.
And we've got an action around sickness. So,
yeah. Okay. Happy to move on. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
You know, this regards to the money. I do take money seriously.
I will check.
And background.
Exactly. Just just quickly then, Chair, if I can, conscious of the time, and noting that a presentation, not just picking up a presentation of the monthly position that was kind of off the press at that date was given to Finance Performance Committee 10 days ago. 10 days ago. So I'm taking the paper as read. There's only a couple of things I just wanted to pull out and highlight. Obviously, performance to month 3, end of quarter 1. Continues to be a balanced position from a revenue perspective. I do need to flag the risks, and interested in, I was thinking about this when we were talking about the risks earlier, and where we are currently with statutory financial duties risk 139 on the risk register, which we did increase, not in this latest round, but we have increased, and I do wonder at what point, just picking up the review of risks that are in 20 or above, and it's currently 16. I wonder whether this may start to push higher as we go through the next few months, based on a few things. One, not least, the risks that are detailed within the paper, which are structured in the way in which Welsh Government requires to report through monthly returns into them. And against each of those, we have to assess a financial value and also a level of risk. There's a narrative from paragraph 25 on in the S bar that covers the number and value, and we have to put a rating against each of them simplistically, sort of, low, medium, or high. Now, individually, we haven't got any that identified necessarily as in their own right individually high risk. But what we do have is a greater number than we have certainly had in the more recent financial years, and a greater value when you add them up. So overall, you would argue that they're certainly, straying into the medium to high sort of overall risk, even though in our returns we won't have any sort of red rated, if you like, high risk. So that's something, me and the team are keeping obviously very, very close eye on, and working through each of those individual risks and how we can manage elements of them, mitigate against them, and with hope obviously clearly of reducing them and knocking some of them off as we go through the next quarter or two of the year. Some of them are dependent on funding confirmation from government, some of them are dependent on things delivering on out savings, some costs in the system not materialising, etc. So there's a couple of technical ones in there, but there's some others too. And I think that one key one around the exceptional cost pressures that we're experiencing and assuming continuing across the NHS in Wales to be covered, particularly for fuel, energy, utilities, probably a little bit less so in terms of national insurance from a cost perspective. But some of those other costs are still quite volatile. The system, as we know, prices are changing almost on a daily basis. But the funding assumptions the government have put in place across the NHS still having to be described as funding assumptions at risk, because the funding source at the governmental level to support this is still being worked through as well. So I just needed to flag sort of the risk element and how that will play back out. There is a concern for me in terms of the next month and the next 3 months and quarter, and for the remainder of the year, given the profile of some of our savings delivery, the need to step back some of our savings, and how we're able to do that based on some of the assumptions that was underpinning that profile at the start of the year versus where we currently are with operational pressures. Some of it does link to staff absences and extraction, so we do need to work through and be mindful of that as we look forward for the rest of this year as well. 2 other things very quickly. I just wanted to flag or mention the capital programme, because it's briefly mentioned in the paper. But we have had a more detailed presentation to executive management team last week with the capital management model, where we're bringing through the current plans for the remaining discretionary application. Finance Performance Committee and board will have seen, the reduced, limited scope in terms of our discretionary application programme this year, given reduced funding and carry forward commitments. But we do have an element of funding left to prioritise and spend, and we do need to make some decisions to make make sure we deliver on some of that spend. Whilst we need to retain elements of contingency because of, again, some price volatility in the market. With a lead time of capital, we also need to make decisions at some point, otherwise we won't spend it during the year in terms of what's left available. So there are 5 operational looks in the scheme of things lower level because they're discretionary rather than bigger schemes going into government for funding, but it's 5 operational estate schemes that we were looking to deliver through our discretionary programme this year, that we've had to realign and reprioritise and decide which 1 or 2 of those we will look to deliver fully in year, and which 1 or 2 we will look to do some further work on to deliver the viability of the schemes, and probably straddle the cost of them between this year and next year. So once we run that through our internal mechanisms over the next few days, that'll come through next April boarding period, the Finance Performance Committee and board as an update, but just to be assured of no contract to the spend money essentially, and also have on the shelf available should there be more money available later in the year, which we don't know yet, and not necessarily getting strong indications from government that they will be fluid capital available to us as we go through the year. Should they be available to us, we can then accelerate some of the schemes and spend some of that pace over the second half of the year. And the last thing was just the I mentioned this briefly earlier, so it's the separate paper that the Finance Performance Committee did receive last week, but on the creation of the Financial Sustainability Work Stream as a separate work programme under the Strategic Transformation Board, which is in response to initially some of the financial planning for this year, not stopping once we got to a point of a balanced plan for this year, continuing work that happened in April and May through EMT, ADLT, and how we know we're going to need to respond going forward, particularly in terms of the financial outlook for next financial year already and beyond. Some of the things we want to do differently ourselves anyway, some of the opportunities that are in the system to do that. So we've had a couple of sessions which have now resulted in the creation of the work programme as it's currently described for specific groups looking at various aspects of benchmarking value, value in the context of value for money and savings as opposed to value-based healthcare, which we have separate progress in. There will be some merging of those 2 streams at some point, I'm sure. Greater efficiencies and some real sort of chunky areas of looking at big schemes, not smaller schemes, but some big work that is going to deliver some chunky sort of efficiencies over the next few years, but also not losing sight and in fact not being shy of the fact that we want to look to try and get more money. We're going to look for income generation and potentially commercial opportunities to grow in a slightly different way than we have perhaps in the more recent past, whilst also having not losing sight of the sort of the more general housekeeping and best practice schemes that we need to continue to deliver on as well. So it's very much in its infancy. Each of those groups have met once or twice, I think, already at most. It's much more focused on next year and beyond, and a lot of the things, the individual projects that will come out of that will be more, will have longer lead times, will have more medium-term impact and delivery, hopefully. But inevitably, hopefully, there might be some quicker wins that we can build into the back end of this financial year if we need to, and certainly a big element of already planning next year's financial planning in a great level of detail than we would ever previously done at this stage of the year. So I'll pause at that point, Chair. I think that's all I wanted to say. The papers broadly but noted and gave assurance that includes the noting of the Welsh Government detailed monitoring returns, which I've got no plan to go through in any detail, but our requirement to Welsh Government that we bring to board for noting as well.
Thank you. We're using that, the detail of that level.
Please.
Just very much welcome in spending the financial sustainability work. I think that's really good news. We're really pleased about that. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, Chair.
I was just about Chris's outlined the challenge, in detail there. We had a good discussion with FPT around some real challenges, where the value for money lies, but importantly, being prepared to exploit any opportunities that might come.
Yeah, that's good.
Is key, because we find ourselves in a position late in the year with an unpredicted opportunity. So being prepared is key. So having the assurance around that preparedness, I think, is key for us.
Yeah.
Well, just to commend the organisation and the execs on the way they've kept finance. There's so much going on, yet they've kept the finances under control, and that's a really important benchmark for us as an organisation to work towards. The only other comment I've got, or It's probably a question. It seems to me that the risk in 23-24 is great, much greater than we've ever anticipated. This year might get away with it, so to speak,
Yeah,
with a good wind. But
certainly, and that is the reason, predominant reason why we've established the work streams that we have already. With, as I say, we're planning in detail already, which we would never be looking to do until probably.
Because I might come back here, I guess.
Also, through committee and through to you.
Yeah, that's looking less favourable, more challenging.
I think just to answer that, Chairman, the message I've given to the team working on the financial sustainability stuff, this isn't more low-hanging fruit, small schemes, 5, 10 grand. This is fundamental shift in how we do stuff, because they need to be recurrent, sustainable, long-term changes, given the outlook 23, 24, beyond. So it has to be big, to be substantial change in how we operate, and not, exaggerate face for example, using black and white tabletop instead of colour carpet in the front of office, it's not that kind of stuff.
Reduce post-its.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's proper.
Of course, in a goal run this alongside the transformation outlay. The answer to my challenge with it, because we've got all this stuff coming through, we'll drive this and fund it. But of course, the world is abnormal in the sense we've got extraordinary inflationary hikes and so on, and cost pressures. So it's a more challenging ask.
Well, yeah, we share the reality of this meeting and F&P, etc., and other committees, but that's not a popular message out into the public or to our staff. And it is an issue for us, but how we make that balance right for the people who work for us, and the public we serve, because it doesn't appear to be an issue financially, just realize out there. But we're feeling some of the gap, and it's quite clear that when you look at your monthly position, that's really tight. Tighter than we've ever had before. So that just demonstrates the early part of the year that we are, it's tight. And the other thing was that the stuff that Lee was talking about, the things we've had to respond to, that's not taken into account as in the heat, the staycation issues, the Jubilee cover, the health well stuff, that's not taken into account. So that causes expenditure for us. So that it is really tight. I think we need to give a message that we're working hard to sustain it, as we said, but that the position is tight.
Yes, it is, and as I say, the risk for me is that, I'll be judging anything, but there's an increasing risk, isn't it? It's that tight, we could be tripping into deficit in the next few months. Holding it that balanced position is getting month on month.
Okay, so we don't. Recommendations. We're happy we've had it, show the discussion. So they note again insurance relating to month 3 revenue capital. Risk mitigation plans, note the monetary return and the actually financial sustainability works. We're happy to embrace those. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chair.
I mean, you highlighted really the finance bubbles under the charts, and then suddenly the autonomy is a high risk, quite big. Okay, then on to IMTP programs.
Thanks, Chair. I won't spend long on this. This report went to F&P, so we actually had a discussion at committee. You can see relatively good progress. It's only Q1. I know relatively good progress on the majority of the deliverables. And just to note, I suppose, as it says at the top of the report, that we are now in receipt of an approval from the Minister in terms of our IMTP. We have had a letter subsequent to your letter, Martin, in terms of to Jason and through to the execs on a range of accountability conditions. That's what happens every year. So we talked about things like sickness and absence rates. Actually, it brings that through. Delivery of workforce efficiencies and implementation of roster. So it does get into a couple of specifics. Interestingly, also asks us to strengthen our value-based healthcare approach, having just sent us a letter saying we don't have any money from that source. But So we will be required in our subsequent reports to board to alert you as a board, us as a board, to how we're dealing with those accountability conditions. So we will do that.
Those conditions circulated. Okay.
No, we haven't
haven't
had a chance to talk about the execs yet, but they will, next board meeting, next board report on this, it will outline all of those and what we're doing about each of them. So that was all I wanted to say at this stage. I think, well, perhaps I will just say one other thing. Obviously, this is Q1, and given the pressures that we've just talked about earlier, you know, summer being very hard, winter might be even harder. You know, we know that some of these types of actions can sometimes get pushed in the kind of need to, you know, kind of a lot of effort and time resource into meetings and those operational day-to-day challenges. So we are conscious of that, and as you will remember, in the IMTP itself, we actually have got all of the deliverables identified as tier 1 or tier 2. So we know the thing, you know, the set of things that we will pause, you know, if things become pressured. So whilst we're doing well, you know, I think we've just got to be mindful of the pressures ahead.
That's one question.
No,
I'm not
yeah.
committed, you've covered this, but it was the, I know there's only one action label red, which we'll know about. We'll obviously be having a separate discussion about that. With 29 ambers, is that cause for concern, or do you feel that that's under control?
No, I mean, actually, what you don't see in this board report, but was in F&P, is the list of all of them. So there are a lot more greens than there are ambers of silver. You can see that on the dial.
Yeah,
and you know, so I think there are all of those ambers which are listed here have all got, you know, in fact, some of them are not really totally in our control. So, for example, one of them is the 111 press 2, you know, roll out. Well, we are doing that alongside health boards, and you know, it's actually their timing that determines at what, you know, the pace at which this is going. So they said they'd do it all in Q1. They're not going to do it in Q1. So some of it is around things that we're working in partnership, and therefore timelines actually we shouldn't be too worried about because they're not completely driven by us. But there are plans, you know, in hand in terms of all those amber actions.
Well, some were quite detailed, so I thought, yeah, we're probably not for the board to be worried about, but they're in the IMTP and therefore we need to track them.
Yeah, and F&P is, you know, is the place where we would talk about that in more detail. Yeah.
The one I want to ask was the change the faculty of emergency mental health, which again is in partnership, isn't it?
Yeah.
With GMW. Is there a plan set out for that?
Wendy probably is,
So we met with the executive last week, so it's part of their IMTP and it's going through.
That again is relied on them.
Absolutely, yes.
We need to differentiate them. So
It may be helpful to do that, actually, you're right, yes. Yes.
Any other reflections?
Scale.
Huge.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did discuss at F&P was that, you know, the amount of activity is both challenging and commendable. So just note that.
Yes, but the current question is, you know, we take on so much that.
Well, you know, we reflected on that, didn't we, in developing the IMTP? I think we're all conscious of that very fact. That's why we've got tier 1 and tier 2 deliverables. We know which ones actually are going to be the ones that, if push comes to shove, we're going to really put all our, you know, effort into. But if you look back at last year, you know, there were an equal number of things we set ourselves last year. We delivered really well against the majority of those. So we've got, I think, you know, we've got a really good set of teams, haven't we, throughout the organisation that are really committed to a lot of the, you know, all of these actions.
There's a slight momentum against Chris is prepared to exploit the financial proposition if it comes our way. You know,
yeah,
there's a little bit of balance.
We're happy to go to recommendations for us to know. the ministers approved that, because who wrote to the chair, who was the CEO, I think there's a point around the line of accountability with chairs of those concerned. But we carry on with the president, of course. Because the chief executive is the cabinet officer. Progress line tea delivery last month. And advise any further information required to ensure water and land to be with all hands. Happy to accept those. Yes. Okay. Last on the sort of active stuff, but by no means least, is the draft engagement programs. So we kind of shared some of this in advance and the flurry with comments.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm really acutely conscious of time as well, because we've got a hard stop in order to make the engagement session later on. So you'll know that we discussed this at some length in terms of our board developments on 2 occasions around how we are couching this piece of work, I think. And historically, obviously, we've had a very extensive engagement framework that sort of slightly hit the buffers as a result of the pandemic in terms of its breadth, but nonetheless, there's a huge amount of engagement through that acute pandemic phase, if we can describe it as that. What we have here today to discuss is a revision, which I've worked on with colleagues, that focuses exclusively for the next 18 months to 2 years, I'm proposing, on our long-term strategy in its entirety, and obviously in terms of focus, particularly inverting the triangles work. We don't have a better phrase at the moment, so I'll continue to use that. We've had that discussion just earlier on about the importance of reputation, the importance of taking stakeholders, including our staff and the public, with us on this journey. And being very clear, actually, that there are a core of stakeholders without whose support we really won't be able to make the progress that we want to take. Lee spoke earlier about what's in our gift, what's not in our gift. And we've spoken also at length about the need for the system around us to work with us, because they will need to shape what they do in line with what we want to do. And that will not just need sort of executive level and board level support in those organisations. Fundamentally, it also requires clinical support, because it's those clinicians who deliver those services in other organisations who will also need to be supportive of this direction of travel, from primary care through secondary care, and to some extent beyond that in terms of the care system. So there is a huge amount of engagement needed on that, and you'll recall at the last board session we touched on how we would approach this, particularly was this now significant enough that it would warrant a formal piece of engagement and consultation in line with government guidance. We have now written to Alison Thomas, who is the Chief Executive at the Board of CHCs, to request a meeting to finalise their view. I know in perhaps in a more informal way they've suggested that would be the case, but we've now written to formally request to meet to pin down the board's view, because that will actually have a fundamental bearing on how we move forward, because as we discussed previously, there are then certain requirements that we have to meet. We would hope to be doing that anyway, but still it puts a certain level of formality and duration into the process. And we have also had some informal and early discussions with the Consultation Institute. Some of you will be familiar with the Consultation Institute. It's an independent body that can provide both sort of hands-on support, but more importantly, I think, for board assurance around the processes that we've put into place are appropriate and are meeting our fundamental obligations in terms of engagement, both with stakeholders and in due course with the public, assuming that we go down that formal route. So what I proposed here today is the framework. It was always going to be a framework. It is not a delivery plan, as I explained at previous board development, because that will now need to be built based on the outcome of those conversations, and also some of that work that we now need to do in short order to understand, if you like, the level of engagement we've done so far. And we have done a significant amount of engagement with various groups over the last, I guess, 18 months. But perhaps we haven't documented that and looked at where are the gaps in what we've done, where do we need to focus our energies, and how do we phase some of this, because the extent of what we need to do is actually very, very significant. So I'm looking at Paul, and Paul led a very significant piece of engagement and consultation in terms of the South Wales programme, which covers, South East Wales and South Powys. We are talking about something that touches the entire population of Wales. And on that basis, we have many, many stakeholder interfaces there to manage. So it's here today for your observations. Thank you to those who've already provided them, some of which I wrote into the final draft, some of which I didn't have time to, but happy to discuss here. One of which, and Kerry made a very valid point about members of the public not just being heard, but being listened to. That is important as we iterate the model as we move forward. And if we do end up in a formal position of engagement and consultation, we will actually have to rewind to the beginning, which is what is that compelling case for change that we are setting out. And then, we cannot immediately to a solution. We have to then work through the feedback we get from that, which will help us shape the final iteration of our model moving forward. So this is here today, Chair, for approval, I suppose, in principle, that this is the framework that we will work to. The delivery plan I'm intending will come to the November board, all things being equal and notwithstanding acts of God, so that we have both the feedback from the board of CHCs. We are likely to, if that's the case, engage consultations to support us, do that piece of mapping around what we've already done, any gap analyses, etc. And also look at the model itself and that case of change, and how we articulate that in order to begin that process of engaging, if you like, from soup to nuts. So I leave it there, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
For reflections, everybody's got a view on this, haven't they? It's great.
That's why I was conscious of time and setting out the stuff.
Yeah.
Well, firstly, I really welcome the ambition around this. I think it's absolutely critical to our transformation. And I'm very passionate about it. I'm going to go talk to the public in particular about this, that we have the ability to process what we hear and then to adapt and respond to that. So I think that's really important, but also quite challenging. And the element of that I think is most challenging is that, of course, we're part of a much broader system, and we've been talking about the challenges in that system today. So, for me, the challenge of going out and talking to a community about how they access emergency care and support is hard to do in isolation from the other services around you. So it's just an observation, Estelle, but I really welcome the direction of travel. So thank you.
Well, I think Estelle said it, this is an enormous task. Huge, we talk about 3 million population. I don't know what everyone is really, but for the South Wales programme, we have 64,000 responses, and you have to look at all of them in detail. Consultation Institute, I've worked with them, they're really helpful, and you have to have a certificate actually from them to say compliant. So this is a major piece of work. I wouldn't underestimate it. The issue about formal consultation is an important one, because then when they do differently, and we need to think carefully about how we raise that and discuss that with the CHCs, because one of the difficulties we've got, I think, is that we have got incremental changes. So our changes maybe over a number of years, whereas generally when we publicly consult formally, it's about the change that's going to happen at the defined date in a defined way. So I think we just need to think carefully about it, because if you add formal, I'm not saying engagement is really important, but formal consultation requires a huge amount of effort, time, money, resource. It does. Believe me, we had a whole team with me working for it. So it's not something to be agreed lightly. It's huge.
No, back on that, Chair, but completely agree with that. And as you say, it's not that our pattern of delivery has stayed static for the last you know, 5 years.
You
It
talk about
hasn't.
APPs
We
this
have
morning.
already started to make those steps. Perhaps, you know, some people may perhaps meant to become really they'll experience it, but they won't have understood that that is part of our transformational change. So I think, you know, as you say, the engagement nonetheless will have to be done. The formal consultation bit, like you, I've got concern about the cost of the enormity of it and what that then brings to us. But even at that engagement stage, as we move forward, there are some very key stakeholders, notwithstanding the importance of the general public. There are some very, very key stakeholders without whose support, and ultimately, as we've discussed here today, reallocation of resource, you know, to make this a reality. We are not going to be able to make our head. We've had that discussion today about the APP bid being denied to us. Now, I think it was Martin who raised, you know, did we make a strong enough case? Well, no one get feedback in what was the reason for that. We need to do a bit of work to understand that. But, you know, we know what that compelling case for change is, but are we articulating it in a way that resonates sufficiently with stakeholders, clinicians, and the public to get them on board with what we want to try to do? You know, I think we've done a huge amount of that, and it might just be an issue of the language that we use and the forum in which we use it. So Jason and I have done a lot of work recently with politicians, you know, and people get it, but we're sort of stuck in that bind between how it is today and the leap of faith people need to take to see how it could be tomorrow. And that is part of our challenge as well, because that's the discussion we had about priming transformation. You know, you're almost running one service while you're trying to shift it along. So it is challenging. So here you fall completely, and yes, we will manage those conversations carefully, recognising also that we know the current CHC infrastructure will be altering in April. Now that I don't see any seismic shift in terms of how that would look, certainly in the early stages as the new body comes into being. And it might well be that we are their first, if you like, formal engagement and consultation thing, and that actually makes it attractive for them, makes it something by which as the new organisation can establish itself. So there's both an opportunity and a risk in that.
We want to be thorough. And the point I was going to make, I'll go to Jason then. It's quite important thing. This engagement piece, whether formal consultation is required or not, is crucial, because we're actually seeking to elicit a behaviour change amongst the public, you know, how they access services, and that's pretty fundamental, and that's not always the case with some of the other service changes we're making. Jason, then come back to you, Martin.
Thanks, Martin. Just to, I guess, go over the point, you know, when you and I met informally with the two chief execs, the co-chief execs of the board of CHC, you know, the indication we had from them was that they were of the view that formal consultation would be required. What we're seeking to do through this correspondence that Estelle has described, it is formally setting the position, you know, one way or the other. We recognise, as you say, Paul, you know, the quantum of effort and resource required between that path and this path is very different. So at the moment, we've got an informal indication from them which suggests that it is necessary. But because of the points that have been discussed here today, you know, our view, I think, may be slightly different because this is more of the same of what we do. That said, their argument, Martin, when we discussed it, was that the quantum of patients from Wales that can experience a different type of service is such that, in their view at the time, it felt to them that it was contemplating this. Nonetheless, we need to set it formally. That's the purpose of the correspondence issue this week.
Yeah, that's helpful. Martin.
Yeah, just, well, first of all, to say this, put the work this, it's succinct, it's easy to understand and comprehend. One thing that we differ, you know, the NHS differs from other industries and services is its clinical leadership framework. What I mean by that is that a lot of organisations are managerially led, they're led by the directors, and we have a distinction, and that is that there's a clinical leadership framework here that needs to be Mel, built into this. Because I know from experience, and Paul will say, well, Paul's clinician, the best who's got an advantage here. But I know from my experience that, people in suits and white shirts standing up talking to people is not anywhere near as influential as clinicians standing up and talking to people about change and the need for change. And I just think we need to make sure that we brought clinicians into the framework that we've got in front of us, so that they're not left standing on the sidelines, but they're actually up front talking about this, because I think that's the way we'll get support.
Because there's also behavioural change required by clinicians to support this.
Absolutely. And they could be the problem if we're not careful, as opposed to the advocate.
Rachel.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we had a good conversation about this, and we had the 4th strategic advisory group. It's the right title. A few weeks ago, and we alluded to this in the importance that in this framework because of that conversation that we had. And I think it's important that we to map out where is it that we have that. Where do we engage with clinical leaders across? What are all the different places, and let's see if there are gaps or areas we need to strengthen. So that's important. But if I may, Chair, I was just going to say we touched a bit earlier on metrics. We haven't got a metric around reputation. It's quite hard to have one. But I think, I'm not sure if we've actually put it in this thing now, but we talked and we agreed that we will try to get some sense from, particularly from our stakeholders. We have lots of ways of getting the sense from our public, but from our stakeholders about what is our reputation. So, I don't think we're completely clear about what people think about us as an organisation. So I'm hoping we're going to take that forward as part of this framework to get a mechanism for not a huge cost, hopefully in a relatively straightforward way, but just getting some kind of sense of what our people feel about us as an organisation, which we can then repeat over a period of time to continue to get that sense of, is our reputation changing, improving, moving in the direction we want. And to me, that I think it may well include some clinical leaders in that as important influences. But I think that to me is going to be an important part of this framework.
Agreed. Are we happy to consider the recommendation? I think it's the right sales pitch still, because it's quite high level. It can make some very salient points about the whole approach, which are very valid without this stage getting into detail, which we could spend ages over.
I mean, the delivery plan will be obviously much more detailed, and just to pick up on Rachel's point there, that reputation audit will feature as an element of that delivery plan, because it's not just our reputation, it's what people understand that we do, because the progress that we've made over the last year, since the new model was introduced actually in 2015, there will still be many people who just think it's what I describe as the Nemo end of the business. And that includes in stakeholders. That's not just members of the public experience our service who perhaps are not exposed to it very often. Some of our core stakeholders still, and that's evidenced by some conversations we've had earlier, still view us as, that's your core business. So to actually say that the extent of what we want to do is going to deviate quite markedly from that in the future is a leap of faith, not just for the public, but for some of our stakeholders.
Yeah, okay. A lot of experience around the board taking in this area, so as you've done already, which was great, sending early drafts of documents out for feedback. So I'd encourage you after this to link into, we've got 2 head colleagues leading on public engagement piece. We're not going to give Paul's expertise, it goes without saying that. But I think Martin's done a bit this time as well. So I encourage you to informally network with the heads. If there's anything that I as chair or my successor can do to support that, we will. On that basis, we're happy to approve this today as the sort of framework we're going to work to. Yeah. Well done.
Thank you. Now the fun starts.
Now the authority it hits, doesn't it? Right, so here we are at 1:15 or thereabouts with what would have been 45 minutes of business, but we can do this in 15. I say that because in large part, we will have covered the escalation items from committees, I hope. And there's a block of consent items there, so we're pretty ruthless, I hope you don't mind. I know trouble has gone into the committee work. There is something, although we discussed all these recycling things, there's also something about trusting that the committees have alerted us what we need to know. And these reports, I think, satisfy that. So I'll ask you each to introduce your report as read. Beginning with you, Martin. Is there anything?
Yeah, the only, we discussed under the alert part of the audit committee highlights for the June 22 meeting. There's only one to draw your attention to, and that's limited assurance on waste management, which was a lot of concern. But we, the audit committee were happy that that was being addressed, and we got it on our next agenda as a follow-up.
So it tracks back to you.
Yeah, so it'll come back just as, from an assurance perspective, I mean, not from an action perspective. And the second one we just talked about.
Because what the committee also received alongside the, what we did as well as just receiving the interim audit report, we provided a detailed supplementary action plan of the plans to deliver against the recommendations within the report. The committee as well, just to get that little extra bit of assurance, as well as just receiving the report.
Well, that's fine. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for adding that.
The rest, I think, it was very well written. It's great.
That's very helpful.
Are we happy to take that as a committee report as read, noting that one item of escalation, which actually goes back to the committee to track? Happy with that? Okay. Moving swiftly on, we've got F and P.
Yeah,
And we think, Kevin.
again, every item on this report has been discussed today. So, yeah, that's. So in answer to Martin's earlier question, it's all coming anyway. The hours lost are significant, as you can see, and the modelling is something that we're going to be very interested in monitoring going forward. Otherwise, everything else has been discussed today.
Happy folks that you briefed. Yeah, again, very good report. I think it's a really positive step forward. And then APC.
Yeah, again, we're waiting for the white smoke, as Stella would say, from Welsh
Gosh,
government. We've got these
matches.
The interesting thing is they have asked us for the sort of report that they ask everybody else for. So we're assuming that's a good sign, not just work for Stella. Otherwise, we've had some really good discussions around engagement and how we're going to move forward with a whole workforce agenda, not just a HE university agenda. So I think that's the important piece there. And Keith Rogers joined us.
I like the fact we get these ahead of the informal agenda bit, so you have a chance to digest what happened in committee.
Yeah, and Leanne, sorry, I should have said, came and presented on one of the priorities. What we've done is looked at the 4 priorities and had someone to come and talk to us at each meeting now to explore in a bit more detail that particular priority, and then sort of try and work out a way forward and how we're going to progress once we get the white smoke from the Welsh government. But Leanne got a load of information down the line in a very short space of time, which is really useful.
Excellent. Happy to receive that report? The time isn't wasted writing, that's the point. I'm sorry, let's go on to charitable funds.
Thank you, Chair. Just an alert on the investment. So due to the market volatility, so an overall gain of 42,000, but there has been a dip, and obviously Chris and the team with increased monitoring of that and management of the fund, and according with the volatility. And also just to say that Trish is leading the task and finish group, looking at a number of priority areas for the charitable funds, and we are looking to appoint a consultant to undertake the strategic work in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. Happy to take that one as read. And then lastly, REMCOG, there are no alerts. Good work done on the PDABR CEOs and insurance around the executive team. Final piece in the loop with your objectives, Jason. This will be nice to meet with you, budget, which is another decision.
Yeah.
We're still on the case with benchmarking executive salaries and small job descriptions up the line for review. think that's pretty much it. That means there was one exit second approved. The only thing I just wanted to flag separately was I noticed, maybe it's just chance, attendance, because we expanded membership, attendance is in and out.
Yeah.
So I was the only person there who did at the previous meeting, so that's something we need to keep an eye on. Because it could be everybody, but nobody, whereas before we had quite a specialised committee. So I think we'll have to look at that. Because you lose the trend. So what I want to do for you, Trish, to keep an eye on, depends on Vader's attendance, doesn't it? We have to have a group. So you're happy to go back before? Okay. Trish, I think that then brings us on to consent items, but one of them is your governance report, isn't it? Short and sharp.
Just for information, Chair, use of the trust seal and the decision we made in private session last time in May around the NHS Welsh Microsoft license renewal.
Happy with that? Rosh. I'll come back to OB in a second, just to note the date of the next meeting, which is there for you to see, 29th of September, 9:30. Trish, we have a resolution meeting private now. It's just a little bit covered, so we're happy to resolve to meet in private. May or may not be this afternoon, depending on events, but the resolution covers us to do so when we can to discuss business that we're not able to. Okay. Any other business from the floor? Okay. All right, the two items of other business for me, not surprisingly. Firstly, Wendy, I think this sadly is your last meeting to the board, other than my invitation. Just wanted to thank you for your sterling contribution as interim director. Obviously, I've seen everything else that's gone with it. You chose a really quiet time to get into. But I think you've been exemplary in the way you've represented patient and patient safety throughout that. That's been through all the board discussions. So we're really grateful for your contribution. You've flown the flag for folk out there in difficult times. And I hope you can, I know that's in spite of that sort of pressure, I hope you enjoyed the experience of being part of the board team.
Thank you very much, Martin. I have enjoyed doing it tonight.
And so we, not getting that very good board development session on patient safety as well. So thank you for your contribution. And very sadly, I know I was upset to have missed yesterday's the presentation, but this is your last board meeting. You move on to pastures new. So I'm sure speeches would have been made last night far better than mine, but I just wanted to thank you personally and also on behalf of the board for your contributions here. You hit the ground with a great strategy and a brilliant pitch with that, which I think really teed us up for the future. And since then, I think your contributions have always been on the ball. I'm thinking particularly the stuff we've had to discuss around the SARS initiative, difficult subject matter, clearly presented, clear way forward for us to get our head around. So those two stand out for me amongst many other contributions. And I think my executives have valued your approach, the way that you've engaged ahead of decisions. I think that's exemplary and something for us all to work on in the future. So sorry, it's sad to lose you, but understand the rationale. But wish you very well for the future. Leanne, of course, is going to step into the beach next time, which is great, but nonetheless, you will be obviously missed. Wish you very well for all that you're doing. Do keep in touch.
Thanks very much, Martin. Yeah, I mean, I obviously won't make a lengthy speech with the amount of time we've got, but just I just want to say thank you to the board and everybody here, because I hadn't been back to January 2020. I hadn't been an exec before. NHS Wales hadn't had a digital exec before. West hadn't had a digital exec before. We were 5 weeks before lockdown and the pandemic. So it's you know, the fact of being able to deliver stuff as a result of that is because of everybody here's support. And just finally, just to put on record a big thank you to my team as well in the digital directorate. You know, taking us from an organisation where paramedics have to go back to station to queue up to go on the desktop to access their emails after writing patient data down on paper. You know, the list goes on. We're still delivering NHS throughout Wales. So you know, that's down to a group of 7 people that probably don't come to these things as much, but they've enabled all that whilst running live services for everything else. So it's a massive thank you to the organisation. It's been a blast.
Yeah, there are a couple of things on for you as well, same as the fight time. As you rightly said, a whole raft of projects have been delivered or have been delivered outside this room that we wouldn't necessarily see. The double transformation of information, so.
There is one more, Chairman.
There is.
Yeah, well, it won't be Catherine's last.
Oh, but I've got one.
No, you haven't missed something, but let me just say, it won't be Catherine's last board, because whilst Andrew, our new HR director, joined us on the 12th of September, my intention is that Catherine will accompany that. To the September board meeting, given that she's literally only just landed before the board meeting taking place. So
I was mortified then, I missed that.
no, so Catherine's last board.
Checked ours, 9:30, 29. Okay. That brings us to the conclusion of business. I just wanted to say we're early on the late finish, so I'll take the accolade. Actually, it's the late time. I was going to say take a long lunch hour, but it's going to be a long lunch, 20 minutes really, isn't it? Because we're going to need to be back here in good order, in anticipation. But don't hold with sandwiches. That brings things to a close. So thank you for your steadfast contributions throughout. It's been a long meeting, but actually productive. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just wait a second while those breaks the connection will come.